workshop for fine. The budget workshop for April 11th, 2022 to order. No need for a roll call. There's nobody here from the public for public comment. So we will move right into the presentation by City Manager Stewart and receipt of the fiscal year 2022-23 budget. Before we do that though, I just want to make sure everybody understands that the process is that the city manager submits a budget to council for consideration. And the purpose of this meeting is to allow the city manager to present that budget, explain certain things of it, give us a chance to ask lots of questions, maybe even suggest changes. But there's no action here, there's no voting, and the manager decides whether any changes occur to the document we have in front of us before it comes to the council. So just want to make sure everybody's understanding that. You're on.
Good evening. Happy Monday. 6:30 throws me a little bit, but I'm in it. I'm in it. So those of you that have been through this many, well, all of you have been through it a couple times, but some of you have been through it more than others. This is my favorite time of year, most painful time of year, most important time of year, because it really sets the stage for the things we want to accomplish. And I know we spend a lot of time in the background getting all of this in order. And the moment we give it to you, I think we think of 5 more things we should tweak. So we have to remind ourselves it's a plan, and that is how we're going to present. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the assumptions we made in the budget that probably have already changed. But we'll talk about how we approached it in the budget and how we're going to look at that moving forward. So tonight, the agenda is to go through the trends. We're going to talk process and the roadmap as far as what we're hoping to achieve in this budget, as well as the next couple budgets. And then I want to highlight our unfunded liabilities. I know we've gotten a lot of questions about that, and I want to make sure all of you are really knowledgeable about where we stand with unfunded liabilities. Also, some of the things we're considering proposing to you coming up. So we want to give you kind of a precursor on that. And then we'll go through each fund in detail. But what's interesting about this particular budget is it's pretty boring when we get into the fund detail, because you guys have already seen the CIP, which is really majority of the changes in the budget. And so we'll highlight those and walk through them, and we'll let you know if there's anything else kind of in the other sections of each department's budget that have changed, but it's pretty straightforward. You're going to see a lot of no significant changes, no significant changes. Okay, so first of all, I always forget to thank Michelle and her team and our department heads who work so hard. Some of you may not know this, but this process starts back in October, November. We spent a lot of time gathering information. We never have enough time, even when we start then. And I just know that her team in particular has been spending a lot of long hours here at home, trying to put this together and present you with the best budget possible. So let's dig into community trends. I did want to note something you're going to see in this presentation is we're really trying to push giving you a little more meat or info on some trends we're seeing operationally. And so we started doing that this year, and we hope to even enhance that next year. So the goal is for you to kind of get a taste of maybe things that don't hit your top list of what we do, but you may not be aware of how much staff time is taken doing that, because it's a requirement for us to do as a municipality. So community health, you've seen these trends in your budget. I think it's always a good check-in point to see how we're doing from a community perspective. Permits are always an interesting indicator, because those of you may be aware that in 2020, I don't know if it was late 19 or 2020 early, we had a hailstorm. And the insurance companies and roofing companies have been bombarding many of our residents for roof replacements, which are eligible. And so you'll see these indicators. We tried to pull out the roof and siding permits because they're all related to those insurance claims. And so in 2020, there's 184 associated with that. In 2021, 121. So, and I know that there are some roof permits active in my neighborhood right now that are related to still the hailstorm from 2 years ago. So those will still be kind of an outlier. But when you remove those, you can see that we're in that 200 range of permits that are outside of that. And of course, there's always just regular roof and siding, but they're not nearly this large. It's all related to that storm. So top property owners, when I teach a class on economic development for city managers, and one of the things that I always note is this is one of the most important things you can know from an economic development perspective, because yes, we want to value all taxpayers, but there are taxpayers that would have a greater impact if they left than others. And we need to be aware of that and understand how to reduce that as much as possible. My goal whenever we're looking at this percentage breakdown is we want the percentages to reduce as much as possible because other values are increasing and they're evening out. And so you'll see there's been some shifting here. Some of the reduced value is related to personal property, but you'll see efficiency jumped ahead of Sycamore Village. These are all kind of in similar percentage points, but obviously the big one is Gustan, and Gustan is continuing to grow. I just met with them the other day and they're looking for additional property. And so it's a balance of making sure that we're balancing that portfolio, because if that industry has challenges, then we can really hurt, or if our water usage is significantly down, which we're going to talk about, because Gustan does not have as many shifts, that can really impact us. So we want to have as balanced of a portfolio as possible on taxpayers. Yeah.
Why is Sycamore Village on there twice? It's 8 and 10.
Is it because they have two different property addresses? They have two
It's
different.
different names, yeah.
One's like the new extension.
Some communities and then the other Sycamore Village.
We can get the specifics on the two differences. I know that question came up before. I usually have a note, but I can't remember what the differences is, but they are two separate.
I think Sun Communities is the modular homes to the west side of that. And then the rest is the mobile home park.
We'll confirm it.
Yeah, and I guess would it be, since they are the same owner, correct? The same owner,
Technically, they have the different names of some communities versus Sycamore Village.
but
So
they're,
those are the two different.
but you don't know if
parcels.
they're the same owners?
They might go to the same property
Okay.
address.
But you're saying if they
Well,
are,
I
you would like
don't
to
know
see
why
them
they-
combined.
I would almost rather see them combined with a asterisk that notes that and jump another one up to 10th, so we know who that.
No, that's good.
But that's just me personally, because if Sycamore Village were to leave, it's gonna be probably all of it.
Yeah,
Or
No,
chunk.
that's a good point. We can make that adjustment for next year for sure. I think it's always good for you guys to kind of have a range of when they start to drop off to when they're all kind of around the same area. But I think we're going in the right direction of some of these reducing as far as percentage of our value, but also others increasing. And I have a slide later that will show you, I think this is an important factor that we've added, is how much single family homes take up of our tax base, because I think that's something that sometimes we disregard, especially on the economic development side, is a lot of hesitation about being a bedroom community, which, by the way, now after COVID, bedroom communities are thriving. And so there's nothing wrong with that, because people now have the flexibility of living or working where they want to. But understanding that so much of our tax base is single family homes should be given just as much weight as our business community. So I think that's always a good factor to consider. So they have that's increased by just a couple, it's not a full percentage, but just under a percentage. That percentage has increased of the value coming from single family homes.
So, do you want us to ask questions like this?
Yes, I
Okay.
love that.
So basically, rounding, 87% of our tax base is single family and our top 10.
Which I can tell you from Gustan, when I first got here, was in the 20%.
Yes, I
So
remember that.
and that's a really scary place for one single business to be. And so I think that shows that there's other growth happening and balancing it out without, it's more across the board than big, because we haven't necessarily changed businesses in those top 10, the percentages have just increased. Single family starts, we haven't had a lot of those. There's a lot of reason for that, as I'm sure you can imagine. But home sales, we did see an uptick in 2021, and you're seeing the average median household sale price higher by almost well over 11.5%. I'm sure you're hearing anecdotally, I know I hear it all the time, that Mason is becoming less affordable and there's less affordable homes in Mason, especially for first-time home buyers. So that is not, that's matching up with what we're seeing as far as percentage of median home increasing. So the allocation of state revenue sharing, this is just a good chart we like to put in because it shows the other area of revenue that we're getting. That's a large area. And I also think we're going to talk a little bit about Headley and Proposal A, and just my pitch that state revenue sharing is a promise that's not always kept, hasn't been kept. And when the state promises revenue sharing for other initiatives, we got to be aware of what that can look like over time. Because I'm assuming when they implemented these state revenue sharings, that the idea was that would continue through many legislatures, and that has not occurred. And so we see the combination of the Headley Act and Proposal A, which we can talk a little bit about, but the impacts are you're looking at general inflation compared to our property values, and you see these big dips, and it takes so long for us to get back to a value of what is actually the market value. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about that, because sometimes I skim over it. The Headley Amendment and Proposal A, I know many of you are familiar with them. I really want to emphasize that this is a Michigan thing. This is not a US thing, it's a Michigan thing. And so when you go to other states and you say, how is the city affording to do this? How is the city? They do not have the caps that we do. They have a lot more flexibility when it comes to property taxes. I know on the economic development side, we would compare states quite a bit, and the lack of tools that Michigan has compared to other states is really challenging. But more importantly, the cities can't prepare for economic development in the way that other cities can in other states. And so Headley, is when we talk about tax rates, a lot of the communities that are on that comparison are at their Headley cap. They cannot increase their millage rate without a vote of the people. And I was thinking, Michelle, that we might want to add that when we start putting those charts together, even with an asterisk of these are communities that are at their cap, and that's why they're not increasing more revenue, or they decreased, as some of them have decreased their millage rate based on that cap. So the Proposal A obviously is that limitation on taxable value that really hurts places like Mason. One of the best things about Mason is people want to stay here for a long time, and they want to stay in their home, and they want to age in place. That really creates a lot of challenges because we don't have the housing turnover that other cities have, which is where they get uncapped. And we have an example. I wish I would have done that right after. Here's an example that I shared with the state actually just last week, because they were looking for some examples of revenue trends. So you can see here, this is a new one. This is not one we did last year, but a house that was built in 2005, built new. The lowest cap value was in 2013. Last year, they were paying a taxable value of $24,000. So basically, a $50,000 home when actually their value was $90,000. And so then they uncap, and it's an over $100,000 home. So the taxes are taking 9 years and a sale of a property to catch up where actual values are. And we understand the idea to contain that as much as possible, so homeowners aren't pushed into higher tax rates. But when you have that downturn we had, which we really felt in 13, if you look at our taxable values, that's where it really hit Mason. It's hard to get back from that. And so you're looking at 9 years to get back to built value of 2005 after that low increase or low decrease. Does that make sense? The uncapping, the issue, it's just a big challenge, and we're not alone in that. And
You
especially
said 9 years, looks like 17 years.
in 13 is when it dropped. They were paying that built value.
Oh,
You see what I'm saying? That 13 is where it really dropped.
when it went down.
Yeah. So before that, they were paying a value that was comparable.
And there's nothing even being talked about at the state level to address this.
I mean, we keep talking. But there's not a lot of, if there's any conversations, it's about trying to supplement with other revenue versus fix the issue. That's the challenge that I think we're facing as a community, because we know you're gonna see in the budget that all the other costs have increased. You know, when we talk about not significant changes in our budget, it's just the increase in medical or health, salary increases based on inflation, all those things. It's not that we're increasing activity that we're doing or adding staff. We haven't added staff in, I don't know, 4 years. And so, I mean, these are not things that we're driving that. There's just no increase in taxable value. The increase in taxable value is so small that it makes it challenging. But yet the expectations of the services to be provided are the same, and we're not even at the values of 2013 in actual revenue.
Was it 9 years from 2013?
So in that particular example, that was their lowest capped year. So this is an actual home that we pulled. And I know one we pulled last year, it was 14 years. They were lower and never increased, and then so they started at a value, then decreased, and then decreased further. So when you start to look at these, you can see that, okay, you're at $2013 now. You know, or you're at actually 2005 when it was built dollars. The house has not increased in value proportionately with inflation or the cost of goods. So that's the challenge. But when you uncap it, you know, you're seeing that jump. And we get a lot of questions. I know Michelle does, I know I do, of how real estate agents are not being truthful to them about the real taxes and all that kind of stuff. Well, they're pulling the taxes. This is a great example. If this person pulled what the taxes were paid on this home, it's almost double of what would have been indicated to them because the value was so low. And that can start to, you know, impact how people understand. We try to do a lot of education on that, but a lot of folks don't understand until they get their tax bill.
How many total houses are in there? Is it like 3,000 total single family home? Is that
There are
right?
about 3,000 water users, right, around that.
Okay, so 172 sales. I was just thinking, wow, 172, that's 172 uncapped, but it's not that.
It's
bigger
not, and
percentage.
the other interesting part, I'm just gonna anecdotally talk about my mother-in-law who has moved to Mason since I've had this job and moved 3 times and uncapped 3 times. And so it may even be a turnover within that time period where you're not seeing as big of a jump. So it could be the similar home. So even the 140 could be 40 homes that were uncapped 2 years ago. And so it's not having the impact. We have a lot of residents that have been in their home for a long time, which is great. That's what we want in a community, but that creates challenges when it comes to this. So when we look at our value millage comparison compared to other communities, one thing that I want to note that this is 2021 millage rate. So it does not have the park millage in there. So you're going to see an increase next year based on that 1 mil special millage voted in. But this shows you kind of comparatively of where we are. But I'm going to show you this next slide where you see total millage, and you're going to see that we start to shift quite a bit based on total millage. And so it's always good to know that in context, our taxpayers don't know the difference. They are paying a tax bill, they're coming to City Hall, and all they see is that Ingham County is a really high tax county. And that makes anything that we're asking for or being provided a challenge to articulate because they're putting it in the context of their overall bill. And yes, it's broken out and all of those things, but they still are writing a check to us. And so they think it's all Mason money that they're paying for. And so we like to do this breakdown of how much of your dollar goes where. And we'll do a sheet that we'll put up on around the time of year that we send out to residents and things like that, of just the information on the budget. And we'll include this so they understand how much it's Mason versus the rest of the funds that they're paying for.
Well, and that county thing's not small. I mean, if you look at St. John, Charlotte, Grand Ledge, they're Eaton and Clinton County.
Yeah.
And they're, I mean, 6 to 14 mils lower. And I'm sure the cities are probably at least in the ballpark of their millage of what we are.
Yeah, you look at St. John's in the sheet before, it's 13.9 in local millage,
Charlotte's is actually higher than us and
but then lower on overall.
lower overall.
Yeah, you start to see some interesting transitions, and that is part of, in our residents, it doesn't really matter to them, it's taxes, which you can understand, we run into that a lot. But it does make it a little more challenging for them when they're looking at their expenses to see how much is going for those things.
Do you have any knowledge, and this is probably an unfair question, so we'll just say no if it's no. How is Grand Ledge and St. John's for that matter, how are they able to maintain millage rate 2 mils to
So
3
I,
mils lower than us?
so I know Grand Ledge, they have had a lot of growth, and the Headley cap is actually lowering their millage. A couple of years ago, they were closer to us. Their Headley cap is actually reducing their millage because their overall value is increasing so much by new housing. And so their cap, actually, they lose percentage or mills, or they have over the last 4 years.
Because of growth in value, not because they've hit the Headley millage cap.
They've hit the cap, and it's actually reduced what their millage rate can be.
Their cap is only 11
Yeah,
out of 20.
I know that Grand Ledge went through a time where in the time since I've been here, they went through a process where their millage actually had to be reduced because of the Headley cap. But they have a lot of growth within the city of new construction. If you're familiar with Grand Ledge, a lot of that is actually within the city limits.
Right.
But that's what I was noting, was it would be interesting, and I think next year we want to make sure we do that, of who is at their Headley cap right now versus who's not. And because some of those millage rates could be that because they have enough overall value from their Headley cap, that's why.
Are there two different Headley caps? I mean, ours is 18.4594, correct?
It's
That's
by city.
Yeah, but ours is 18.45,
yes.
so there's only one, it's a millage. The millage is the Headley cap.
Yes,
So you're saying that they're capped at 11 1/4.
because
Grand
their
Ledge.
other value
Okay.
has increased, because it's an evaluation
I
of
know,
their
it's a
overall
really
value.
stupid, complicated formula. Try to explain.
I don't know if they've recently decreased outside of their Headley, but I know at least 3 or 4 years ago, they actually had to reduce because of Headley.
Okay.
And so that's part of the evaluations that city may have to then go to the voters to say, let's keep us where we were at millage rate. But part of that evaluation is you're getting enough revenue from new development that you're at a similar revenue portion. So their overall growth is higher than the Headley cap allows. Does that make sense?
One other quick basic
Yeah.
question. Are we comparing apples to apples? Is 1 mil in Grand Ledge the same as 1 mil
No.
here?
Well, it can't be.
I mean, like, we have water.
Their mill's probably.
No, what he's saying is the
Their
value of a
mill's
mill.
350, 400,000.
That's what I'm trying
Okay.
to find.
So that's what
Their taxable value's gotta be way higher.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That's what's lowering their cap, is their overall value is higher, so 1 mil equals more.
1 mil equals more.
We have full-time.
Okay,
firefighters.
so they're not really paying less in taxes, right?
Well,
Or are they
they're-
because it's
well,
spread out?
Well, no, they're paying less in taxes because their millage rate, so as an individual, my home value, I'm paying less there, but as a community, they're getting more revenue.
I get it, okay.
Does that make
Thank you.
sense?
Yep,
Because you're gonna see,
Yep.
there's gonna be a difference, it's gonna start getting complicated in our budget, because you're gonna see on the park fund, the millage calculation for 1 mil for that is different than the street, because of the timing of them, and so what is removed and what isn't. And so mill value, even within our own budget, is gonna have different values for 1 mil.
thanks. Yep. I think I knew that at one point, but then,
Well, no, and it's a good question, because you'll see that might be some good information for us to add the next time of what is the value of a mill, and then what the Headley cap, because I think that would tell a lot, because you might be able to see in some of these communities that the value is so much higher.
Well, if this is gonna be the kind of thing you're gonna
Yeah.
include in this report, if I'm a taxpayer, I'm gonna look at this and say Grand Ledge is about the same size as us. I'd say kind of similarly located. They're a distance away from Lansing. They're in a cheaper county, I get that, but their city millage is 2/3 of ours. And I'm gonna
But you
say,
know,
I'm gonna say, Mason, go talk to Grand Ledge and find out why they don't have to levy more. And I'm not saying what you're saying is the answer to it, but we need to be able to
Yeah,
lay
but
that out
easily
and
say
say, yeah, their taxable value is, our taxable value is 200 million and theirs is 500
Well, and the
million.
other good comparison would be Leslie, because you see that they're at a much higher
Mhm.
millage rate, it's because their mill value is so much lower. And so being able to express that, I think both ways would be helpful
Mhm.
for people to understand. Okay, any question on trends or things that you would have liked to see in trends that you didn't see when it came to revenue or tax or community health that we might be able to include next year? Obviously, the mill stuff that we just talked about, but anything else? I think and let us know. Not gonna put you on the spot. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about process and our roadmap. So process, I love this flow chart. You guys see it a lot, that we are in the budget part of the flow chart. So we've done the CIP, that flows into the budget. And then as a reminder, obviously after the budget, there's an additional council action that would take to award contracts and things like that. We likely will be coming to you with some changes to our purchasing policy and how we're approaching things right now, because I heard just in my one-on-ones with department heads, one of the number one policies that's causing them the most frustration and time is tracking down people to respond to quotes and things like that, because they're just not responding. And by the time another person responds, the other one has expired and it's a lot of staff time. So we're going to be talking a little bit about different approaches to that. But that would be the council action for when we actually award contracts. This is the overall plan for the budget. So as far as the budget flow chart, we are in the part where staff is presenting the budget, as the mayor had mentioned. And then in between now and the public hearing for council, we will provide any clarifications or corrections you see or things like that in time for you guys to fully vet the budget when you have your meeting. So the required process, this is in the charter, really lays out when we have to prepare things. We always reference this as our timelines. For a reminder about multi-year projections, not every city does multi-year projections. We do it with a purpose to really have a better understanding of our financial position, kind of what's coming, trends that are coming. I can tell you this year is a great example of how important doing multi-year budgeting is, because we see some things in year 3 that we want to make sure we prepare for. Strategic response to the financial reality, you know, what's ongoing, what versus what's one-time expenditures. Really, when can we use the fund balance for a one-time expenditure versus is this an ongoing thing that we need to plan for? And then the long-term sustainability of the community's desired services. So if we're seeing a trend where operations for desired services cost this much and we can't cover that as an ongoing expense into multiple years, then we should be implementing it without a revenue source. So we also like to think about our stewardship of public funds. I think to me, this is the most important thing that your group as a council needs to focus on. When we look at a budget, why it's so important is we want to ensure a fair tax rate. We want to have a commitment to a balanced budget, which is legally required, and meet all the other fiscal requirements. We want to understand what the basic services are that our residents expect and that they are funded adequately, and that our program services are as efficient as possible to be provided. We want the budget to be based on an accurate CIP. And so you're going to see all the CIP that you adopted into the budget. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to handle that when it comes to cost changes. And then we want the proprietary funds, which is the water and sewer fund, for example, to be self-sufficient. We should not be supplementing that. That should be a self-sufficient fund. And that revenue is realistic and conservative. We don't want to be overinflating revenue to make it look like we can afford more than we can. We want to be realistic and conservative. So when we talk about appropriate reserves, we have shared with you before this goal of being between that 20 to 35%. We are in that range for this budget, and we're going to talk to you about why we're in a little bit higher range, because we see some things in year 3 that are concerning that we want to make sure we're planning for. We also think that costs are gonna come in higher on CIP items. We're already seeing that trend. And so we would anticipate using some of that fund balance towards those so that we can keep moving on projects. If we are over that 35%, our focus is fully funding pension and OPEBs, moving up our debt schedule, pre-funding and accelerating capital improvements in the CIP, and reducing the millage rate. We are not there on any of those items. We do have some additional contributions going into pension and OPEBs that we'll talk about, but we're really in that range. And when you start to look further out, we start to get outside of that range into a concerning fund balance. Okay, so now I'd like to kind of keep this slide in here because it's a good track of where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. And so I just friendly reminder of my time here and a budget roadmap. You know, that 16-17 is when I was hired. We made no changes, was really an assessment of the organization. 17-18 was when we first did a realistic CIP and started multi-year budgeting. It was rough, if you remember that year. Wasn't great, but we didn't have a lot of things in years 4, 5, and 6, but we at least started to develop it. That's when we did our tax increase to maintain the base level of services that we established. We also, the following year, enhanced technology. That's when we upgraded our website. We did the customer service area. We refined our plans, the CIP and the budget. We got a lot better the next year. And we developed a strategy for long-term capital that was feasible within the CIP and the budget. This was also when we started negotiating with unions. And we really tried to develop a strategy so that we could start addressing some of the unfunded liabilities. The ASME contract came up in 1920 and it's up again this summer. And so we'll be renegotiating that. But in 1920, it was really a focus of getting our pensions under control. And then we completed the park plan. And we also put on hold capital that year due to COVID in the spring. And last year, again, it was really a capital hold and a staffing hold. So we got really behind on filling positions because we wanted to understand the impacts of COVID. We also completed our union negotiations with the police, both unions, and reflecting kind of where we wanted to be and refining and confirming our capital strategy. So the year that we're in currently is we're trying to minimize the long-term impacts of COVID by starting to do projects that have been on our list. We're getting staff, hiring back to the base, which has been a challenge. I feel like we're in interviews every other day, but we're trying to get back to where we are at an appropriate staffing level. We're in the process of developing that long-term adaptive strategy with your help, the master plan, and we're completing the design and funding for all of our large investments: library, parks, DPW, wastewater treatment plant. If we didn't want to do anything else, it's a lot, all in one year. But the best part is next year is about construction. It's really the focus on implementing these plans and designs and funding mechanisms. We know that COVID is going to throw us for a loop on costs. So we got to evaluate what we can phase, what we can do in parts, what we need to delay, all of those things. But our hope is that we're going to be moving on some of these projects within the next year, and they are reflected in the budget. We also will be implementing our long-term adaptive strategy, which is the zoning updates that will come out of the master plan. And then the master plan is going to have a very focused action plan that will also drive some things that we need to attack in that year. Next year, you're also going to see some things in the budget that include asset management plans. So our focus is to really, the facilities that we have existing, really do a good analysis, hire individuals to really do a full scope of what are the main expenditures. We're starting to run into some challenges with this building that we want to make sure we're on top of. And so how do we plan accordingly for regular replacements of certain equipment and things in a facility? And then the following year is going to be continuing that construction and finalizing all the asset management plans. And our goal is to have an asset management for 20 years, an asset management plan for 20 years. There's really, when we talk about a plan, there's not a lot that's surprising in municipal government and things that we need to accomplish as far as facilities upgrades and things like that. We know a roof lasts about this long, a road lasts about this long. Those are things that we can plan for. There's always going to be shifting and prioritization, but our goal is to get it all written down, get a plan so that we can see it all and be able to identify all the needs. We're going to miss stuff, but we got to start somewhere and really start putting that on paper. And that's what we've done with the CIP. The first couple of years were challenging, but now we get it more and more refined each time. And we think that will happen with the asset management plans too. Any questions on where we are and where we're headed? Does this seem in line with what you think is the focus that we need to be doing? Okay. Well, the last 2 years have been challenging, to say the least, and our staff has been really faced with dealing with a lot of uncertainty, but also figuring out how we move forward in the most positive way. And so we've spent a lot of time as a team, a leadership team, but we've also had an all employee in service to really talk about shifting our focus on our organizational purpose. And so we have changed. You may have been aware of this, but as an organization, we had a mission, vision, and values that was operational, and we threw it all out. We're like, too many words, we're too exhausted to even read it. And so, and no one could remember it. And so we decided to really trim it down to just saying we're committed to serving our neighbors. That's it. And all of our employees are bought into this. We've talked with them. This really represents their individual jobs and everything they do. It's just really about committing to serving our neighbors. And I know sometimes these things can just seem like words, but you're gonna see in some of the trends, the things that people brought forward were more about how they served our residents than about some of the other things that maybe we would have prioritized before, like innovations or things like that. You're gonna see that department heads actually brought forward, hey, this is an area I think impacting our residents. And so just shifting our mindset that this is where we want to be focused, I think has really helped us. We've always had the values of the one city solution mindset and whole person, but we really refined them in the last few months. So one city, one employee, our employees are essential and different perspectives make us stronger. This is really there's no job that's more important than another. We all have to help each other out, and we want our employees' perspective on all the projects we're doing. So for example, our entire team weighed in on the DPW facility concept that you guys will be seeing next month. They all gave feedback, and they had great feedback that really made us think about some things differently and some things that we didn't see in the original plans. And so that was really great. And they're going to do the same with the park plans before you guys see them, give us some feedback from their perspective. Solution mindset is our team has the confidence to seek solutions. This is really a focus on our employees really needing to solve the problem at the time and helping the customer when they're faced with the issue. And really, as a management team, empowering them to do that and allowing them to do that. And then whole person is that our culture prioritizes professional development and work-life balance. This is the thing that we're hearing the most about right now. We've always had whole person, but our employees are much more sensitive to this, and applicants that we're considering are much more interested in this. They see this in our posting and they want to know more about it. So we talk a little bit about that. That's everything from our policies reflecting our views, but we really view whole person as reflecting Mason's culture, which is Mason values people improving themselves and supporting their families and being accessible to their families and all those things, and we want to do the same. So we're really trying to look at our policies again and say, what are we missing? And we've gotten some really good suggestions from our staff. So that's some things that they would like to see that I'll talk a little bit about. Okay, before I dig into highlights, do we need a break? Do we need a little snack? Ready to keep going? Yes.
I am.
Okay.
I'm here, he knows.
There's another option for a break if we need one. So you didn't overcommit. Okay, so long-term debt summary. We're going through the highlights. And we're going to be going through the unfunded. We're going to spend a lot of time on the unfunded liabilities because I want to make sure you guys are up to speed on that and personnel costs. So long-term debt summary, you saw this in the CIP, but I know it's a best practice for the public budget document to also include it. So these are not anything new, but it's just a kind of breakdown of the debt that we currently have. But I want to talk about personnel. So we have no increases in full-time staff proposed. We have no increase in part-time hours proposed. We have moved all of our part-time staff to a minimum of $15 an hour. We have found that has gotten us over the hurdle, but we may actually need to consider a bigger increase based on what we're seeing in the market right now for our permanent part-time. But that's been a jump that we've made for all of our part-time and seasonal employees. Our ASME contract is up this June, but they did just select a new union, so it won't be ASME anymore that we will be negotiating with. They've just voted for a new union. I can't think of what it is right now. If you guys remember,
TPCO.
it's not one I'm familiar with. No, so it's always challenging. We just went through a police change in union. It's always challenging, the first contract after a change, but we will get through it. And I'm interested to see what they might bring to the table. Police contracts are already in order, and they include a 2% wage increase based on last negotiation. Our non-unions, we're recommending a 3.3 wage increase, matching the state's inflation rate. That's what we targeted instead of the federal multiplier, which was significantly higher. But the 3.3 seemed to match also what our taxable value is increasing by. So that seemed to be a good reflection point. I will say I am doing regular evaluations with employees if they propose a market comparison to show that they should be getting paid a different level, because as I'm going to mention in some of these trends, we have employees that are being directly targeted by other municipalities. And that's something that I know Michelle, I'm sure, is getting calls. I'm sure Mike is. We all are getting. There's the challenge of recruitment right now that's happening for all. I know I saw that our DPW folks got water operator flyers from Grand Ledge and some other things. So I mean, they're definitely being targeted, and we have to be aware of that. So recruitment trends. We're seeing that the hiring process has to be expedited substantially to keep candidates. Our 4 to 6 week process with multiple interviews, an exercise, something where they do actually field work. If we take more than 2 weeks, we lose candidates. We've had 2 openings recently where all the candidates left by the time we got to interviews. They had other offers. We are still getting qualified candidate pools, but some of the applicants that we've made offers are leveraging those offers to get raises at their current employers. And I don't think they come in with that idea, but when they go and tell their employer they're leaving, their employer offers them a significant increase, which, they can't. I don't think it's with ill intentions at all, especially the 2 that I'm aware of. They sincerely came to work for the city, but their current employer countered them.
Would we do the same?
Well, we can, because we're in a union environment with a lot of these positions. If it was a non-union position, we might have some opportunity to do that. I would definitely consider it. In these positions, and the ones that they were applying, these were union applicants for union positions, which we don't have the flexibility to give them anything in addition to that. We are getting out. I participated in 2 interviews in the last week, and both interviews, multiple candidates asked about our culture and our ability to support and encourage families and support of their families. And I'm very proud to say that we can point to a lot of things that we have that make that not just us talking, but actual policies implemented. So I think we're positioned well when it comes to that issue. Retention trends. We have a backlog of leave banks that are making coverage really difficult. So even if we're fully staffed, if you have a large group of employees who haven't been taking vacation time because they haven't been able to travel, they haven't been able to do certain things, or they haven't felt comfortable doing those things, they now are at a point where they need to use their leave banks. And so we're seeing that we have a regular rotation of a lot of people out every week. And so we just have to get through that, but that's something that obviously makes some of the other employees a little burnt out as they're covering for those. As I mentioned, our employees are being targeted by other municipal positions. I'm not sure I appreciate the targeting that's happening by some of the other communities, but they're all getting, a little more aggressive about how they're focusing, especially when it comes to, they know every operator that has a license. They know who is skilled in this area, or who's gone to this training, and is definitely becoming more challenging. We recently did an in-service, where we did a lot of anonymous surveys about a couple different things about how employees were dealing with stress, what was their enjoyment level of work, did they feel appreciated at work, what were resources that they felt they needed, and over 50% of our employees anonymously surveyed expressed interest in health or wellness tools or challenges or resources to reduce and manage stress. And so we're gonna try to focus on implementing some of those, including I met with the school last week. And we're both talking about partnering with their community education program, where they provide classes and access to the pool and things like that, where we may be able to have a partnership with them where they also have their employees get access to those resources as a wellness resource, because we're seeing that across the board that our employees are wanting more of that. And so of course we had requests for a weight room, aerobics classes, all kinds of different things. Well, that would be a great partnership because the community education program already provides all those things. And so is it just about us getting access for our employees and encouraging them to pursue those things? We've also seen some communities recently start to incentivize doing things like your annual physical, so that it's just encouraging those employees to get in front of a doctor at least annually to be preemptive on some of their health challenges that they might have. And so we saw in those surveys, one of the questions was, do you feel like you have the time to take for yourself to deal with stress? And overwhelmingly no. And that was at home and at work. And so how do we provide and get them access to resources? We have a great employee assistance program, but we got to get people to use it. And so that's part of the challenge. Yeah.
Quick question. So noting the $15 minimum salary, also the challenges of the market, have we done any sort of market analysis across all positions, or is it just kind of, I'm trying to just figure out what approach we're taking in figuring out whether we're paying employees fairly?
Well, MML does a great wage survey across department head level positions. We can kind of get some comparisons there. We also have our regular comparables, of other communities, especially when it comes to when we get to union discussions, we'll be pulling a lot of those. With our permanent part-time and our seasonal folks, it's really market driven, because right now you can walk in to a fast food restaurant and make more than what we're paying. And so we have to constantly evaluate where can we, and our permanent part-time in particular, I feel very strongly about that these are folks that are choosing to be part-time, but are very skilled and could easily work in a full-time position in our city and be paid significantly more to do the job they're doing. But for part-time, so they're saving us money by being part-time and not having full benefits. So we have to evaluate those wages. So we implemented something with our permanent part-time where they start at 15, but there is actually a progression that if they become a specialist in their area, they get a unique skill that only, so for example, if they get trained to be an election specialist to be able to step in for Sarah, that they could actually run an election because they have the training, they'll get bumped up to another area. So that makes sense for her permanent part-time person. And then we also have an additional level that you've taken on more responsibilities that follows like Dana, where she manages our website. She does some other things that a permanent part-time person in the past maybe wouldn't have had those responsibilities, but we're really trying to encourage those positions, because what we're finding is we have really great people in them, and they have options to go anywhere because of their skills, but they really like the flexibility we offer. And so we're trying to really formulate. We have a couple that are just really strong, and we just hired 2 new permanent part-time positions last week. We made offers this week. Great candidates. And they were very interested in that progression, knowing that they could grow here even in a part-time position.
Does, for work culture, is, hybrid is still a thing? I was just watching some report and people, if they do come back, and how companies need to kind of help fold them back in because of all the exhaustion. And then, maybe changing work hours. And I wonder, are we thinking like that's going to be part of the new culture too? Because that also is so much with mental health and.
Yeah, I mean, we already, what I'm really proud of is when we transitioned COVID remotely, we were one of the only municipalities in this region that did that seamlessly. We never had a day where we weren't serving people. And the reason we did that is because we already had, Michelle had done great work about setting up VPNs for certain employees so that they had the flexibility. So we already had the model. It was just transitioning it to more employees. And so it was a really easy switch and we were able to do it in just a couple days over a weekend, I think. And by Monday we were up and running. And so we already had a lot of these things implemented. And I know, for example, like at our DPW, they have a different shift that works better for their team, which is a very early start, but then they get out of here at, I think, 3:30. And so we would really try to respect that and not push on them to be here 3:35, because that's got to be part of the culture. If you're going to give those changes in schedules, you got to respect it and separate that. And I know all the departments are handling it individually, but they're all open to flexibility that works to get the job done. That's our main focus, is we come back to that committee to serve our neighbors. As long as we're serving our neighbors and we're able to implement it, I know Michelle in her office has a combination of hybrid for some folks when they need it. We also have the ability to change into that if we need to. For example, somebody needs to be home with their kid, they can work from home that week as long as they can get the job done. That's the focus. And we've really shifted evaluating people on that versus the hours they worked. And so making sure we're honing in on that. It's a little bit more challenging with the union. I'm really interested when we go into this union contract negotiation, if there's going to be some interest in that. I expect there's going to be some interest, especially from the folks in City Hall, to have a little more flexibility than what the union contract allows. And I think we're open to it. We just got to figure out what works for both parties.
Really good.
Do you know, I know this is not necessarily an easy question, but do you know what percentage of the general fund budget is labor?
I don't know if we pulled that number
It's
before.
easy to pull.
Yeah, we can get it for you.
Right now.
Yeah, we
I'd
can
like
get
to
it
know
for you.
because I'm gonna guess that it's a lot lower than what businesses are. But I'm curious. I'm just curious.
We can get that for you. I was gonna say, I think we pulled it a couple of years ago because there was a question related, but I can't remember what the percentage was. And I'm sure it's not that far off.
Well, and it might be interesting to know what it is for the water and sewer fund too. The
Yeah.
other big.
Yeah.
operation.
Okay, so other post-employment benefits, or what we call OPEBs. I was told very clearly that I should make sure I spell it out in at least one slide, because I just say OPEBs a lot. And so this is really retiree healthcare is what we're talking about. And so my focus in giving you a little more information about our unfunded liabilities is I want to make sure all the council feels comfortable with where we are and the steps we're taking, and also has a good understanding of the challenge that we face and why we face that challenge. So OPEB liabilities, we're actually in pretty good shape when it comes to funding. The state indicator of a concerning OPEB liability is when you're less than 40% funded and you're 70% funded. Obviously, we want to get as high as possible to that 100% or quote, 90 range. But we're in a good spot right now. We have 17 active employees that will qualify for this benefit, and we have 13 current retirees that are pulling from this benefit. And retiree healthcare is no longer offered, and it hasn't been offered since 2012. So this is not an issue that it's continuing to grow. It's an issue of these are employees that came on before that are eligible for it. Any questions on that? I'm gonna spend a lot of time on pension. There's not really a lot on this. It's closed. We're not doing it anymore. It's just about funding the liability that we have existing. On pension liability, this is the summary that we get as part of you guys get as the audit financial statements. This was a change a couple of years ago where they really wanted you guys to see, all councils to see the funded percentage, and then the state provided an indicator of where it's a concern. And so our funded percentage right now across all of our plans is 71%. It's an average. And the state indicator is if you're funded at less than 60%, then it's a concern. Obviously, with pensions, we want to get higher and closer to that funded level. It is a moving target. It's a very frustrating moving target because whenever an actuarial comes out, our percentage decreases even though we contributed more because the assumptions change. And so that is a challenge for us. But 71% of our unfunded liability right now is due to current retirees. These are not people that are eligible, are in the plan that are going to be eligible. This is people that are pulling from the system right now. 71% of our liability is associated with them. So if that shows you, we're really just off tilter on, and we'll go plan by plan and you'll be able to see it very clearly of how that has changed. So sometimes people ask why MERS, so I just wanted to throw in something here because you can do other pension programs. There are communities that do their own pension within their jurisdiction. There's other mechanisms. The reason MERS is, it's a known entity by a lot of employees. And as we talk about the market changing, we do get asked if you have MERS, because if they're coming from a MERS system, they can easily transfer and add on to their years. And so that is one of the advantages of the MERS system. It's not the only game in town, but it's just the one that we've been using here, and it's one that makes sense when you talk about recruitment of other employees, especially at a higher level position. So let's talk about our pension liability details. So I'm going to go through each of these plans, but I highlighted one that is our problem plan. If you look at number 10, general non-union, it's closed and it is only 46% funded. If you look at the others, they're 80s, 90s, 100% funded. And it just shows you, we're going to talk a little bit about why that plan is so off. But that really influences all of the other percentages. And you see the unfunded amount is a pretty large amount. And so that is one of the biggest challenges. But you see that plan is closed. If you look at the plans that are currently open, they are funded pretty well. And so that's kind of the challenge we have going in. So I'm going to go plan by plan. Division 1, general union, that was closed in 2013. It is 84% funded, has 7 active employees that are eligible or that are eligible for this plan. And the average age of them is 52. We have 4 vested former employees, which means that they are vested in our plan, but have gone to another jurisdiction or things like that. So they'll be eligible to collect when they get to a certain age. We have 12 retirees currently, or their beneficiary currently pulling from the plan, and the average age of those is 70. So the benefit plans, so 2 1/4 multiplier, 10-year vest, 5-year our average compensation, and we froze the COLA in 2021, but they had COLA prior to that. You'll see the contributions or FAC is based on a very long list. You're going to see as we get through to different plans that average compensation gets much smaller of what you can consider in it.
What's FAC?
It's that final average compensation. So when we say FAC, you're going to see an FAC of 5 or an FAC of 3.
Average of the last 5 years.
5 years, yes. But what's interesting is depending on the plan, what's included in that compensation is significantly different. So if you got a sick payout, or if you had a vacation payout, or you had some other things that you were doing in those last 3 years, you're going to see a big bump, even though that's not what you've been paying at the rate in. And so the employee contribution to that is 12% for active employees. And when we say employee contribution, that is active employees. So as these plans shift, obviously we're not going to have as many active employees and more retirees. So you have no one contributing that's
Well,
active.
We've got 7.
We have 7 right now, yes, but it's an average age of 52.
And I think you would probably be very, very accurate to say within 5 years, you'll have 0.
I think,
Because 55-15 is the.
Yeah. So you're gonna see, I put in each plan, how we got here, what have we done, and what are the next steps. How we got here, you're gonna see that these plans were enhanced. Whenever you see things like for retirees, that's a big red flag, because the plan was enhanced in a way for people that were not contributing. So if I'm a retiree contributing, I'm contributing based on the rules at the time, right? Well, now I'm retired, and if they negotiate an enhancement for me, I haven't contributed to cover that. And so my payout is now larger, but I haven't made the contribution. And that's when you start to get lopsided plans. And you see that trend in a lot of our closed plans, is that they became very lopsided. Incentives were given, or benefits were given, I'm sure it was good times, to people that were already retired. Well, they didn't pay in, and so there wasn't the value there, so you start to see this flip. So with this plan, we've adjusted the amounts, we've closed the plan to new hires in 2013. Last year, we did the COLA freeze, and we reduced the rollover of vacation. So there's a couple different strategies that we're taking here. So we know that in this particular plan, for example, vacation is an item that is part of your average, your final average compensation. So the way we've approached it is not reduced vacation for employees, but said you need to use it. So you can't build up a big bank for then us to have to long-term pay for your, what your final average compensation is, even though that's not what you've been basing your contribution on. And so your rate, your salary is jumping right at the end because you're getting these payouts. So what we've said is you can't carry over as much. We want you to take it, but that does lead to people taking more vacation time, which creates other issues. So it's this constant kind of figuring out where the sweet spot is. So in Division 2, this is.
Can we?
Yeah.
Just, maybe you've already thought of this, maybe it doesn't matter, but couldn't we make them pay the 12% on vacation hours? Because that's what you said is an issue, right? They're taking all this vacation time at the end, but they haven't paid the 12% against that time.
But they would only
Could
be,
we?
they'd only be paying it on that one payment. They wouldn't
It'd
be
be a
paying
lump
it over
sum,
time.
paying it all at
Yeah.
once, but it'd still be 12% something.
And they do versus taking on all those items listed. So they do pay the MERS expense on all those contribution FAC based on.
But just as a one-time.
Right.
At the end. Okay, all right.
So Division 2 is our police closed pension plan, which is 84% funded. It has 2 active employees that are younger, and it has 7 vested former employees that have left and 2 retirees that are currently pulling. So this is a 2.5 multiplier, 80% max. Again, FAC is based on a lot of things that, especially in a police union, raise quite a bit because there's a lot of overtime and things like that in those last years generally. And you can see how we got here. Again, we have some things for past retirees. That creates challenges when it comes to funding. And then we also, you see like a change from FAC 5 to FAC 3. That creates a challenge because you're now shortening and you're averaging a higher compensation at the end of their career versus over 5 years. So all of those things start to impact the funding level. When you look at Division 10, this is a problem division. So this is 46% funded. We have 7 active employees, 6 vested former employees, 21 retirees and beneficiaries with the average age of 71. It's a multiplier of 2.5. And so it's important that you see the multiplier because when you talk to other communities, when they talk about their pension plans, multipliers are a huge consideration of the cost and the liability. And so when I tell people that we have closed plans, but we have an open plan at a 1.5 multiplier, they're like, oh, I love that. Because to get to 1.5 multiplier is a big step for some communities.
And that means, the multiplier means again.
It's a multiplier on your years of service. So you multiply that by your years of service, and that's the percentage you get of your wage and that final average compensation.
Yeah.
And so there is a max. So like on this one, it's a 2.5 multiplier up to 80%. So what you'll find is there's employees that when they get to that max, there's no point in them working anymore because they can't earn anything more. So the current employee contribution is 10% to this plan for those active. And you'll see here, one of the biggest challenges with this plan is it's our non-union plan. And so we have a lot of, which I'm proud of, internal promotions. But when someone is in a union plan and then they transition into a non-union plan, they're at their highest wage for their fewest amount of years, probably. And so they're in a plan, they're vested, and they're gonna get paid out at this plan level, but they haven't paid in for the time period as the other plans have. And so you're seeing employees transfer into this plan when they're at their highest wage, which creates some challenges in itself just by the nature of it. This plan is closed, but you may have, so for example, we just had somebody a couple years ago that transitioned into this plan because they were hired before 2012 and got promoted. And so it's not that the plans are closed, but it doesn't necessarily mean someone may not be eligible to come into the plan. Division 12, general non-union. This is hired after 2012. This is 81% funded, 6 active employees, 1 retiree that's pulling from the plan. It's a 1.5 multiplier. We start to see a little bit reduction of the contributions that are considered. And you're going to see the employee contribution is 4.5 and the employer contribution is just over 5. I want to bring that up because one of the next steps that we're talking about is, do we move to a defined contribution plan? We are proposing a defined contribution plan that would have a 4% employer contribution. And then if the employee provides 4%, the city would match an additional 4% for a total of 8% contribution
From the city.
from the city, which is higher than what our current employer contribution is. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, we know that there are some employees who will not match. And there's an encouragement to have them match, but if they don't, we are at the 4%. As we know, I'm sure that when you look at those plans that are a challenge for us now, there was a time when they didn't seem like they were a challenge. Just like our current plans don't seem like they're a challenge for us. And we're really well funded, but we lose control when we have these open, defined benefit plans. I can tell you, I'm very conflicted, and I know I've talked with some of you about this. We have evaluated this. I know Michelle and I have evaluated it. I evaluated it when Eric was here. The numbers don't necessarily make sense right away. You're paying more for new employees than you'd be paying if they were in the current pension plan. But what it does provide is long-term sustainability for our city to make decisions. Because with every union contract, you can decide what your contribution is. You can decide if you need to switch it. I can tell you, we presented this proposal to the police union during negotiations. It was a non-starter. They wanted to be at almost a 15% contribution from the city to get out of a pension. And we just decided this was not the union contract to do it. And so we won't be presenting it to them. You know, we took that off the table, but we had the intention of presenting to council at your budget approvals, a proposed defined contribution plan that would mimic this 4, 4, and 4. This is right in the middle of what other municipalities are doing. Some are doing more, some are doing a little bit less. We think it's a good kind of mid-range. We are very realistic that when union negotiation happens, it may change, but that we think we need to start with non-union having a defined contribution plan. So I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, this is the recommendation for all the unions that we're closing, or all the unions that are currently active, all the pensions that are currently active. But the general non-union is the only one we can do without a union negotiation. And so that's the one that we'll be recommending in the next month or two to change and establish. So questions on that?
Yes. Which one is this? This is,
We're talking about 12.
so for $30,000, we can make it 100% funded. $32,000. And,
For today.
well, for
I mean,
today.
yeah, sure, it'll change.
And then we
Yeah.
get to keep on.
Yeah.
But if it becomes defined contribution, all of those numbers freeze. No more active employees, no more retirees. It only goes down from there.
Well, not necessarily, because the other plans you would have said would only go down once people shifted, but then the actuarials go out longer than they,
But what I'm saying
Yeah.
is, it becomes
It-
defined contribution, so you no longer have a beneficiary that you're funding. Once they leave, they fund themselves with their,
Oh,
plan.
completely, yes, I'm sorry.
and so,
Yes, on the
and
defined contribution, we're
employees,
done.
current employees are not funding past employees, because the past employees would have funded themselves, but the expensive part, right, is the transition.
Yes,
Because you have to run both plans at the same time.
yes.
But once you're out of it, the defined contribution is dramatically cheaper for the city and gives us much more flexibility. I mean, I don't know how you
Well, I
can't say
don't,
that.
well,
right?
I don't think you could say it's dramatically cheaper than the C plan, because we're paying actually less than we would be paying in the defined contribution.
But we're on the hook forever. We're on the hook till people die.
Right.
Whereas to me, that's
It's
a
about-
huge,
Yeah, it's about control and sustainability to shift to a defined contribution. It's not necessarily about a financial savings right away.
well, I guess I think it'd be important to do some studies to get some data, you probably already have, or you've at least thought about it, from places who have defined contribution plans with similar pay scales to what we have, to see if it is something that is going to shoot us completely in the foot with everything you've done to try to build a culture of people wanting to work here because they just like working here, but make it so not good for them, pension or retirement wise, they can't. In other words, if you're working in a $200,000 a year job, 444 would be great. If you work 20 years, you make 4% or 12% on that much is going into your retirement, you'd be okay. But if you're in a $50,000 a year job, it's a whole different story.
Well,
And if you work
yeah.
20 years, 25 years, let's use the 55-15 thing. You work 15 years. Are you even gonna be close to having enough money to consider retiring? Now, granted, that's 17 years before the federal government says you should retire. But have we done that kind of,
Yeah, I mean, there's some challenges. So there's the reality of when we're talking with personnel. So when we talk about people that we're recruiting, no one, I feel confident, there are very few people ask us about our retirement plans. When they're coming in,
I
that's,
think people assume that nobody's getting pensions anymore.
well, and so that's part of it. But what I have already seen us struggle with is when we talk about the C plans versus the B plans. So the B plans are the more 2.5 multiplier, really healthy benefit. And C plan, which is a 1.5 multiplier, that the reality is if you have a C plan, you should be doing additional contributions somewhere else because it's not gonna be enough. And so we see the differentiation between that and our current employees. So you have employees that are doing the exact same job that are getting a significant difference in benefit. And we're already seeing some of the challenges related to that, and the unions are unwilling to consider a different pay range. And because we're making the argument that a C plan, you should be paid at a higher level potentially, because even if you paid them 3 or 4% more, the benefit that they're getting is still significantly less than the people in the B plan. And so when we move to defined contribution, you're talking about a dramatic shift in benefits. And so my concern is what I've seen happen in other communities is that if they don't have some kind of graduated scale, or they don't evaluate it in that way, they do start to lose candidates. Because if I'm gonna come in and make what somebody who's getting a 2.5 multiplier plan is making, but I'm gonna make the same thing and I'm gonna get a defined contribution, it doesn't take me long to figure out that the benefits are significantly different. And you see that even, a prime example, with our chief transition. We have a police chief who is in a closed plan, 2.5 multiplier, who benefit package hourly rate is probably maybe 3 times what our new
He
chief
was
is
in
coming in.
B3.
Yeah. Who our new chief coming in, who's getting paid higher. I mean, it's a dramatic shift, and we have, Mark won't be joining us as a full-time employee until October, and we have told him our goal is to have a defined contribution in place. He will not, if it's up to us staff, he will not have a pension, he will have a defined contribution. He's well aware that has to go to council. But part of that defined contribution will still include a vesting time period. And so we still hope that it will retain people, because that's the challenge we're seeing with other communities that no longer provide a pension, so they can't retain people. So we're still gonna have a vesting. I'm not sure if this percentage is where the unions will land, and I would want to match whatever the unions do with the non-union. And so that would be something we would have to be thinking about how we work through. So we've done a lot of research. I know I've talked to some communities who are really struggling to move to the defined contribution financially. It is a big financial hit over time because that transition is expensive. But if every year we don't make it, are more hires coming in that are in the pension plan. And so you look at even the last year, how many people we've hired that are now in an open pension plan if we don't make this change. And we can't make the change until we do union negotiations for a lot of those positions. But that's why we really are trying to push forward the non-union, because the chief position, we want to be transitioning into that.
Is there a hope that, seeing that this is a trend where municipalities are able to offer something that's smarter for them financially than a union? Like my grandfather's back in the day union, right? Will municipalities have more freedom in the future? Like, do you think these union things are gonna fall away because of the different trends we've had to make because of COVID?
I think
People, work culture, like,
Yeah,
there's this
I
huge
think-
shift.
I think this next year is gonna be our toughest union negotiation that we're gonna have.
Well, yeah, you're in the middle of 7% inflation.
Yes, I think it's
It's
gonna
always
be,
been easy when it was
Yes.
1%
I
inflation.
think it's gonna be a very challenging
You're gonna want
negotiation.
7% raises,
And a lot of other things, I'm sure.
or 10, yeah. You're right.
And so this is gonna be a challenging time to do negotiate, but I also think it's an opportunity. Because there's been some things that we've been wanting to implement when it comes to tiering and some growth plans within the union that they've been hesitant about before, that we think we might be able to pursue. And we have employees that want them. And so figuring out where the right fit is, it's gonna be an interesting negotiation with it being a new union. I'm gonna choose to be hopeful that they're gonna come in with some maybe different ideas. And so there are some things, I'm just gonna say that there's some things in our union contract that don't represent our values that we need to change, whether it's a negotiation item or not. I know one thing that came up during COVID, for example, is the delay in healthcare, health insurance. It's 90 days for health insurance. Well, one of our employees is working here and they get sick, they can't go to a doctor for 90 days. I mean, that's not, that we need to fix some of those things.
Yeah.
And those don't need to be negotiated things, those just need to be fixed. And so I'm hopeful as we go into the union contract, but I think it's gonna be a challenging negotiation for sure.
Let me ask you this, though. I understand the difficulty.
I do.
I think, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, your ideal would be that everybody's in a defined contribution. Is that true or not? Forget all the difficulties in the transition, but that
If
ultimately,
I could start day one today,
yeah.
if I could start with no history, yes.
But even with the history, forgetting the costs of transition, would it be better for all of our employees to be in defined contribution?
That's where I'm struggling.
For the city, long
For the
term,
city.
for the city, long term. I know, as an employee, I fully understand you. I'm getting something. So if that's the goal, I guess my question then is, if that's the goal, what's gonna change to make it easier to do if we wait? What could possibly make it easier? Because Leon just mentioned to me, because we were both on council 20 years ago, this was pushed by council then. And it was, but back then everybody was in a B plan and, including the manager, and nobody wanted to really take it seriously in the city. Yeah, we're doing great. We got money, doing fine. And auditing standards were different. All this OPEB stuff didn't have to get reported. The whole thing, it was just a different time. So there's no real big, but if we'd have done it then.
Yep.
It'd have been relatively easy to do. I mean, it would have still had transition costs and whatnot. So my question is, what can possibly happen by waiting to make it be better?
I can tell you, we're gonna have something, we've already gotten the paperwork from MERS, we're gonna have something for non-union in front of you within the next month to implement. The challenge is gonna be negotiating.
Okay, so it's really not, you're prepared,
We're on
you're
board for
prepared to
non-union.
deal with it.
Yes,
It's, you just know that the union
we were
folks are gonna.
We were
fight it.
prepared to deal with it in the last police contract, and it was not even, we weren't even in the same ballpark. They wanted, the argument that they made, which is gonna be the challenge with, is that they wanted their new employees to have enough contribution to equal what their current employees were getting at retirement, which they calculated to be close to 15% contribution by the city. And so, which again shows why we can't afford to keep the pension plans going, because that's the challenge.
Well, I'm sure you've done your comparables. I know my wife is an employee of MSU. And MSU is on a defined contribution plan for everybody, and has been for a long time, because she started working there 26 years ago. They're 555. You have to, in fact, they require you to contribute 5%. And if you give anything over that up to 5, they'll match. But that's, I mean, that's just an example. So you're at 4, 4, and 4, basically the same thing, although I don't think you're actually flipping it. You're saying, well, wait a minute. MSU puts in 5 and requires you to put in 5, and then they match some number up to another 5 if you put it in.
So
We
we're,
may have to jack that number up if you want to do it, but I guess that's.
well,
that's
but,
good.
why we are approaching it this way is we believe there will be some employees who do not want to contribute and would rather have a higher wage. And so we'll at least set aside 4% for them.
Well, you could almost make it more than 4%. I mean, the other side of that is the 4% into the defined contribution is pre-tax. And then the 4% on salaries is pre-tax, so there might be something there too. Right, I mean, your defined contribution plan is gonna be a pre-tax kind of thing, tax advantage. It's gonna be, is it a 403 or a 401 or
It'll be 401.
401 for city?
Okay, so general non-union, you're gonna see something soon. General union is 100% funded, has 12 active employees with an average age of 38, 1 vested former employee, and no retirees pulling from that plan. That is a 1.5 multiplier. And if you look at the contributions, the FAC is only based on regular wages. So you see that you're tightening down a lot of the liability when it comes to that. The current employee contribution is 4.5, the current employer contribution is 3.9. So this is again, one that would require a union negotiation to transition into a defined contribution. This is the police hired after 2014. This is 96% funded, 8 active employees with an average age of 34, 2 vested former employees, 0 retirees or beneficiaries currently pulling from it. Again, based on regular wages. And so no current employees leaving prior to being vested and withdrawing their contributions. We do have some employees that might leave within that time frame without being vested, which is a factor in some of those. Police supervisors, we only have 2, so that's why this fund is so highly funded. We have 0 active employees in this one, 1 vested former, and 1 retiree with beneficiaries. And so this shows you, this is very similar to what you saw in the other plans as far as increase for past retirees and things like that, but it is funded. There is potential for someone to move into this division if they were hired before 2014 and then got promoted.
So our sergeants aren't in that one,
That is the sergeant's one.
but it says there's no active.
No,
employees.
our current sergeants are too young. They were hired after 2014. So they are in the police union.
Oh, they're in the.
But you could have, I think we have 1 employee at least that was hired before 2014.
2 that
To,
could
that
possibly-
could get promoted to be a sergeant
Okay.
and would come into this plan. So we also have this surplus division where we contribute, and it's a way for us to contribute outside the whole plan, but set aside funds that can even out our cost overall. And so when we talk about next steps, I just can't emphasize enough that we need to not enhance benefits for employees that have not paid into it at that level.
By that, you mean don't enhance retiree benefits after
Yes.
the fact.
Yes, And I know that MERS has even taken the action to make changes so that no benefit enhancements can be made unless the plan is 100% funded. We have plans that are 100% funded, so don't be tempted. No matter what, if I'm not here, do not be tempted. That is not a good move. Even if you think they're in a good position, that's always creates this flip-flop of issues. Continue funding our plans using the annual required contribution and then doing voluntary additional contributions. The budget allows, we're very focused on that. Closing all defined benefits to new hires and moving hires to defined contribution plan. That is our recommendation for our next step. Obviously, we know that the first step is non-union, and then hopefully that will help in our negotiation for the union contracts. We also know that there's some proposed legislation out there regarding helping municipalities pay down some of that pension debt. We think we may be eligible for some of that money if it goes through, but we would consider that just an additional contribution. We're not recommending reducing our annual contribution for that year. When we get that, we want that to all go into the debt, and so that we're compounding it, not just supplementing that revenue. Any questions on unfunded liability?
Then I'll just ask one
Yeah.
question. Looking, I mean, I understand completely what we're trying to do from a fiduciary standpoint. Would you say culture is the strongest selling point for the city from the employee standpoint, or what would you say is our biggest tool of attracting talent?
I think culture is really helping us more now than I ever thought it would, as far as we can actually demonstrate where we are flexible with work-life balance. We can demonstrate that we have policies that reflect that, with paid parental leave, we have volunteer time, we have other things that they can see. We hear over and over again in our applicants, the ones that rise to the top, that they want a job where they can show they're having an impact and make a difference. And we have that as a competitive advantage, but it doesn't do any good if you don't allow them the time to do it. And so we're really trying to focus on that. Right now, I'm doing middle manager check-ins where I'm asking them specifically, if you were offered another job, what would be the thing that they have to be offering for you to consider it? And interestingly enough, most are replying that they don't want to leave. They really like working here, and there's certain things they like about it, but there are certain things that frustrate them. And so we're also tracking what are the policies and procedures that make it really difficult to do your job. And it's interesting because some of them are very easy to fix. I mean, they're really easy to fix. And so
It's like Taco Tuesday.
yeah, I
or something?
can give you an example, a very specific one. I won't name the person, but they've really been putting in a lot of overtime covering for folks and dealing with issues. And they ended up having a family member have a funeral, and it was an extended family member, extended family. And they put in for funeral time, and it was denied because it didn't fit into our specific detailed bereavement. But we have the ability as department heads and city manager to overrule that if it's a close relationship. And they didn't have any concerns about all the overtime they were working, the people they were covering, any of that. They were just frustrated that when they put in for that one day of bereavement, it wasn't approved, when they really thought culturally that was what we represented. So we fixed it. Like, it's just as simple as that.
Why didn't the department head just approve it?
It just fell through the cracks. It was a transition of people and somebody else approved it, and it was just, but it's one of those things where it was a good reminder of, one, we need to make sure all levels of employees bring those things forward when they happen, because we just want to fix it. Look, if this doesn't feel like it matches our culture, let's identify it early. We also have had a lot of almost, I think, every single interview I've done, because I've also done these same interviews with our department heads, purchasing is the biggest challenge right now. Our policies do not match the market, and we have to figure out a different way. I mean, even just getting 3 invoices, Kate is taking so much of their time. You're chasing down phone calls, all these things for less than a couple $1,000, and it's just not matching the market. And they're basically saying, I'm spending time after hours to meet our purchasing policy. So we're going to bring something forward for you guys to consider. But those are the things that we can fix that. I did have a department head bring up that they really wanted to see more benefits for their part-time employees, because They didn't think it represented our culture of them being as valued. And so how do we figure out, we have a little bit of sick leave, we have some other things, but for example, we're off during Christmas to Christmas and New Year's. We just adjust their schedules, and that department head was advocating for them to get a percentage of pay during those times, just like full-time does. And so those are things we're looking at, but they're not big costs, they're not big issues, they're just small things that all are very culture focused. And so those are things we can address, you know, that's not hard to do.
It's a vibe.
Yeah,
People just want a vibe.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we get into detail by fund, you want to take just a quick break? I would like to take just a quick break to get a water.
Yeah.
You know, if I were, I would like a membership to the garden club if I were here. To the garden club, yeah.
Now you don't want to.
I would think like that would be something that would, as a new employee,
60 something
tonight,
anyway.
indoor flowers.
Yeah.
Like that
Oh,
would
you,
be
do you
a
go
cool
bowl in
perk
the OTAP tournament today?
as like my welcome.
Well, we have,
That's like, that would be.
well, our
Oh, I
leadership
see.
team, which would probably be
Oh,
beyond this, but we have talked about assigning each leadership team.
Is this just, there's nobody in here remotely, is there? Just recording? This
No,
is just
no,
recording.
no,
It's a
posted,
ghost.
so that's, it'll be online.
Is this video too?
She's watching all of you.
That's why she's been laughing.
I assume that Deb just watches the game tape to figure out how to improve.
Well, this way she can see each of our facial expressions while she's talking. and get,
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah,
That's pretty
there you
smart.
All right.
Okay, so we are gonna dig into detail by fund. So if you go to the section where we start to get to tabs of general fund, this is where we're going into that detail. As I mentioned, when I was putting this together, you'll see that there's not a lot of interesting things happening because you've already seen all the CIP stuff, but we'll walk through. Because we don't have any staffing changes, we don't have any of those things, so it's just really CIP that you may have already approved or some trends that we wanted to identify for you. Okay, so general fund. Overall, when you look at it, you're gonna see that we're gonna be in that 32% fund balance range, which is closer to the 35. But when you start looking out, you're gonna see that when we look at some of the capital projects, you're gonna see some large contributions in year three that we're looking at. But when you look at the mill value, this gives you the breakdown as well as the revenue from the revenue sharing, which is an increase from the current year projections. And we, as I mentioned, are keeping that higher than normal fund balance because we're expecting those costs to come in higher when it comes to the CIP and also what we project in the next couple of years. So this is the chart that gives you the projections of capital when we look at the general fund. This has really been helpful for us to kind of track large capital investments. And you're going to see that when we go through that there's a large increase in operational expenditures in year 24-25, and that's because we have a big contribution to the street program. And we also have an increase estimated because contribution to the DPW, some of that will come out of general fund because of usage. And so that's why you're seeing that operational jump. So we're going to be spending a lot more time over the next year. And when we look at the CIP of figuring out how do we even that out, if we can even it out, and is that a blip or is that an ongoing, like the operational and the DPW contribution? And how does that impact capital going forward?
When you say you've got a big expenditure going out to the streets, you're saying that the CIP, the way it's currently constituted, shows a lot of street work in 23,
24.
or 24.
Yes. And so do we shift some of that so that there's some coming out of different funds, or how do we do it? This is why I think 3-year budgeting is important. And I know for you guys at all, you're seeing it all kind of combined, but we do this in 2 very separate stages. We do CIP first, really focused on prioritization. And then when we integrate it into the budget, we start to see some things that we need to look for. And so that's why we always get nervous in the CIP if you're changing things in the next fiscal year, because we've already been kind of planning of how that's gonna look for the last 2 years. But when you start changing things in year 2 and 3, budget process really helps us see the impacts of them. Is that something we can actually afford to do? Do we need to even it out? So those first 3 years of the budget really help us with the next CIP. So when we look at expenditures and we go through different categories, the council, there's no significant change from budget. What I removed is, so if there was an expense, so for example, I think you guys had a study in council last year, that's removed, and then we just look at operations, there's no significant change. Manager, you're gonna see an increase related to the contract changes. Assessing, there's no significant change in the budget. Clerk, you're gonna see an increase in personnel costs related to the elections. And so there, you know, she puts in a number based on the anticipated need for election workers. Whenever we have a major election, that increases, so that's every 2 years you're gonna see it. So I wanted to put in some trends in each of the areas that may give you a different perspective on some of our operations. So we are seeing a jump in FOIAs. We saw a significant increase in 2021. We processed 163. That's the highest ever of FOIAs that we processed. 70% related to the police department, which is not unusual because they need them for cases or things like that, but it takes a lot of time because you have to redact the reports. You have to do a lot of those, a lot more work than a traditional FOIA. So we typically average around 120 to 130 a year with FOIA, taking a significant amount of staff time. And that staff time is not recovered through the cost of a FOIA because you have to pay, there's a minimum charge that most FOIAs fall under, that if you don't reach that, then you don't charge. But then if they're higher than that, as far as the staff numbers, you can only bill by the lowest available employee to do the job, lowest level wage that is available to do, not available to do the job, but could do the job even if they're not available. And unfortunately, because of the sensitivity of a lot of the FOIAs, it's mainly our department heads that are processing them, but we're billing at our entry level positions because you cannot bill at their level.
Is that a state law?
That's part of the FOIA Act, yep. So whoever's capable of doing it, and it's the lowest level employee capable of doing it.
But if it's a higher sensitivity, so it needs to be handled by a
It's not
department.
that a police officer can do it, they don't have the time to do it, so it's ending up in Sarah or our police chief's hands to redact those
All right,
areas.
thank you.
Where are you seeing the FOIA requests coming from? Is it largely media, is it citizens, or is it organizations?
It's usually related to the court system, so it's attorneys, people being represented at a ticket or different things like that. I mean, when you see 70% of those are related to the police department, we have FOIAs that will take a significant amount of time for one to do, and then we'll have ones that are super easy that we can knock out with 10. And so it's a hard range to tell, but it's a lot of staff time. We are seeing municipalities, this is a trend across all municipalities, but we're seeing a lot of them figure out whether they need to have a FOIA coordinator. In 2021, we actually contracted with someone who was a retired police officer to help us with just our police FOIAs. So she would come in and just do the redaction, because you have to have someone that is authorized in the software and all of those things, because we couldn't keep up. And so we're trying to figure out if this is a true trend or if this was a year off of that. But if it stays at this level, we're going to have to evaluate whether we need a contract employee to help us with ongoing.
Is there a
Could
char-
that, sorry.
I was just gonna say, is our charge for those requests, is it, appropriately aligned with the amount of staff time and resources that goes into that?
Yeah, there's a minimum though, so that if it takes within this period of time, you can't charge. So it's got to get over a certain threshold, and then we can pull those numbers to see what we're actually charging, but a lot of them, I don't think we're recovering the actual cost it takes to do them.
Could this be a specialist job?
Potentially, yeah. So the other trend we're seeing is the absentee voting trend, which on the surface doesn't seem like it would necessarily have a lot of impacts. But when you look at the numbers we're seeing in transition and absentee, we went in 2018 to just over 1,000, to 2020 to over 3,000, to right now we have a current permanent absentee voter list of almost 3,000. What's the difference here is when you come in and you vote in person in an election, we have multiple volunteers or election workers, they're getting paid, but essentially volunteers, helping you through multiple stages of the process. When you absentee vote, all of that is handled by our city clerk and her part-time assistant. So when you're talking about.
Why is that though? Why couldn't we use an election worker to do that?
Well, you can, but the timelines are very challenging to predict when they come in, because once they do an application, they have to get it out within a certain time frame. They have to do all of these things. And so we have talked about shifting to staff, having more election workers present throughout that time leading up. It's just hard because the workflow is so hit or miss. But we're seeing, especially at November elections, a need that we're gonna have to bring people in sooner to help process them. If you saw just the baskets of ballots that the clerk was sending out for the last 2020 election, it was so much work. And it's just a complete shift in how workers are used. And a lot of the election workers are okay to help with one day, but can't come in and necessarily help for a week or two in advance. So that's also a challenge, that it's a different type of volunteer we're now looking for. On board of review, there's no significant changes, and on the treasurer finance, there's no significant changes to the budget. But I did want to identify a payment trend that we're seeing. I'm sure you're not surprised that we saw a dramatic shift to auto payment, credit card payments, and online payments during COVID. This method is definitely easier for our customers, but it has not reduced our staff time. We've been tracking that. We have a lot of reconciliation that has to happen on the back end, whether they pay electronically or in person. But in the end of the day, this overall increase of cost to the city, I think, is at the benefit of a service to a customer and serving our neighbors. And so we're not recommending a change in it, but we wanted to be realistic that it's not actually reducing our staffing time or costs. And so you see how the credit card fees are increasing. It's because we're getting more payments in that nature.
Can we do like a lot of the businesses do if you pay by credit card, charge them an extra fee to recover some of that?
We did previously, but the council a couple of years ago decided that they wanted to have that be part of the processing of payments and to encourage more people to pay in that way. There are some benefits, obviously. I think if you get on an auto pay or some of those regular payments, we ensure that we're getting payments on time and regularly, and making it as easy as possible. We did get a lot of complaints when we did have the additional fee about that fee. And so I think it balances out as a service we're providing, but it's something that the council should be aware of, that is increasing because we're having more people shift to it. And I think more people are shifting to it because there's not the fees too.
Agreed.
So when we
Do
get
you
in,
think, but do you, is the fact, the reconciliation process, which I understand, we would have to reconcile no matter what. We reconcile whether it was a check, we reconcile, that's an expense no matter what, but what we're trying to do is save money here because we're paying a fee to
Right.
collect this money.
we think it's.
Do we have any chance of doing that? Is there something that's gonna change? Do we need to get more people? Do we need to get to a certain critical mass of a number of, a percentage of our payments that are automatic through credit cards and whatnot, that enables us to do something through some scale?
I think one of the things that we're not able to capture effectively that I do think is happening is our customer service has been able to help in other areas and other departments because they're not spending as much time on this. And so while we're not seeing necessarily a dramatic reduction in staff time and finance, I think customer service has shifted quite a bit. I know, for example, there's another trend I'm going to show you that has to do with open permits. They were able to jump in and tackle that project where they probably wouldn't have been able to do that if they were handling as many payments in person.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
handling payments in person, even Well, yeah, because now probably any payment in person is going through customer service.
Yes.
That envelope or check's not being opened in finance anymore,
No.
where it used to be.
Right.
So yeah, that would definitely be a savings
It's not resulting in the savings of staff time that we thought.
in finance, for
In
sure.
finance, for sure, yes. But a shifting in availability of our customer service to do other things, I think is definitely occurred. When we get into technology, there's no significant change in the budget. On buildings and grounds, there's a CIP project under there, which is the city hall renovations, which is focused on phase 1, which is the customer service area, as well as the city clerk's area for confidentiality and things like that. We are working on our space evaluation. We've just reached out to an architectural firm who has said that they are able to move forward with the project, but their timing has some lag time, so it's going to be a couple months before they can do the full space analysis. Legal and attorney, no significant changes. Property, no significant changes. Forestry, we have an increase that includes Hall Boulevard tree replacement project. You remember this, we removed the trees there, and we will be putting some new trees back in.
You're going to replace the trees in all over.
Yes,
Has the forestry made a department, made a decision to get taproot trees and not spreading root trees?
I know that the tree commission weighed in on a recommendation. I don't remember what.
We've already got the trees and they're ready to put them in.
But are they taproot? They're not spread like locusts that spread and break up the concrete?
No, they're not.
They're not. Okay. Thank you. 'Cause I have locusts in front of my house, my sidewalk. Like this.
Where is that in the budget? I don't see anything in 271 that's significantly increasing. In fact, the
It's-
overall budget went down.
It's not I don't think it's a significant increase, but it does include that. So I think some of the trees,
The forestry budget's actually $5,000 less than what we're anticipating for.
What operating supplies? I think it's the current year projected, see how it's more.
current year, but then we're assuming another $20,000 for this year or next year, sorry.
I think they had planned on getting that done by the end of June, is that right?
I believe so.
But you don't know what kind of tree they're planting in there?
The tree commission weighed in on it. I don't remember what they decided, but they made a recommendation on what they wanted to see there. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight was we have a citizen request system, and trees are definitely something that our citizens care about.
Yeah.
Over 40 of the 150 citizen requests we received in the last year are related to tree trimming or removal. And so we're continuing to evaluate what is an appropriate resource for this area and how we can stay on top of managing those tree requests and the expectations. You know, we have a lot of interest in more trees being planted, really keeping that tree canopy in our community. I just wanted to make sure we highlighted this because this is not something that from a staff driven perspective, we're hearing it from residents that this is really important.
One of the things that we need to do is to keep up the canopy, and that involves not just a 5 or a 10-year plan, but that involves 50 to 100 years.
Well, that, like, we
Yeah.
have a tree study like sidewalks, right? So
Yeah.
like, we know what's coming and what needs to go, but making sure it has healthy neighbors so that we're not just taking a block out
Yeah.
is the hope.
Yeah,
for
and
the
really
tree future.
evaluating the long term, where strategically we should be planning and how do we mix up different types of trees so that we don't have one disease impacting multiple. I get a lot of comments about trees and medicine, which is
Yes.
great.
Yes.
And the cemetery, this is where we have the CIP project, the columbarium. I wanted to give you some trend information that we're seeing in the cemetery area. We've noticed an increase in cemetery burials and lot purchases in advance. Residents are more apt to be thinking and preparing for final arrangements than we've ever seen in the past. We're also seeing a lot more interest in cremation, which led us to the recommendations for the columbarium. So if you look comparatively in prior years to 20, we would average around 12 to 15 lots being sold, and in 2021, we sold 40. And so in burials, you'll see that there was a large increase as well, and the cremations percentage of that, is hitting almost 60%. And so providing different options is something that people that are coming in are requesting. And so we're hopeful that this meets that need while also preserving as much space for other needs in the cemetery as well.
There have been a few changes to the cemetery rules, so someday you might look it up.
Does that mean we're gonna get a lot of
Pardon?
upset people, or are they good changes?
No,
Yeah, please
it's just
define.
that many people do not realize that a cemetery lot is real estate.
Yes,
And if you are buried in there, you can't give permission for your kids to be buried there unless you put it in your will.
yeah.
So that's the big one.
Did you have a lot of interesting issues that come up?
Oh, yes.
Yes. That was one thing that when I hired it for this job, you guys did not tell me how much stuff would be related to cemetery. There's a lot of problems with cemeteries that are very difficult to work out. It's not as easy as I would have thought.
But you have quiet neighbors.
That is true. We do have quiet neighbors. Under police administration, this is where you'll see the CIP project, police in-car digital recording system. So this is a replacement system for that. I know that they're already starting to get some price quotes on that and figuring out the best way to move forward. Crossing guards and police patrolling, there's not significant changes from the budget, but I did put in a trend in here that we're seeing that I don't think you're going to be surprised by, but we're spending a lot more resources spent on citizens and with mental health crisis issues. We're continuing to expand our training in this area, but we're finding that there are limited resources available for our citizens after our contact. So we pulled some numbers here to just give you an idea of the uptick we're seeing. In 2021, we saw 91 calls that included one of these areas. So suicide, mental health, overdose, or similar. But then when you look at how many cases were listed only as mental health, that was 87. And those are ones that are specifically requesting some kind of service. They need some kind of service provided to them. And so these are not uncommon for us. And there's definitely ones that are probably repeat calls on here. But it just gives you an idea of how often our police officers are dealing with these types of calls. And these are not calls that are quickly resolved. They're calls that they're spending a lot of time at those homes and doing regular check back ins with them. They are giving us a lot of feedback that they're definitely feeling frustrated because they're wanting to support families in our community, and there's just not a lot of resources for them when they're struggling with a family member that's having that mental health crisis. So that's something that we're obligated to perform that duty as law enforcement and respond. But it's definitely something that we're seeing taking a lot of our resources.
So just to be clear, 87 of the 91 were mental health.
Correct.
It's not additional 87.
No, it's within that. Those were ones that were specifically calls for service, some kind of other resource that they needed.
Can you help define crisis? Because I think often we want to think that, you know, my child is suicidal. But when this type of training and what I am aware of that our police are involved in, like we were talking psychosis, cutting, screaming, blood, like real mental health crises for a lot of our younger community members. I just wondered if you could.
Yeah, when you know, a prime example is, you know, someone might say, oh, well, was this kid just not getting along with their parent or something? That would not be triggered in these calls. That would be a domestic call. It would be under, and these are folks that actually will likely be triggering an actual petition for service. And so we're seeing that much of an uptick in that. The challenge that we faced, especially during COVID, is a lot of the facilities didn't have any available beds or any available services. And so you definitely saw ones that maybe were, the other thing of this is that you can, if a police officer goes to a call related to mental health and there is any concern of drug use or anything like that, they have to stay with that individual at the hospital until they can be cleared to be released into a mental health facility. And so that takes a ton of our resources because our police officer has to stay with them. And so until they can be determined to be safe and clear to go. So when you're talking about this many calls, you're seeing it almost doubled in 1 year of challenges and resources have gotten even less in that year, not more. And so that's something that they're constantly dealing with in that department.
Is the increase due to any change in clarification of mental health crises?
No.
It's the
I
same as
mean,
it was 5 years ago.
it's the same threshold in laws that they have to meet certain thresholds in order to move forward. None of that has changed.
Are any communities doing any sort of like partnerships with social workers or behavioral health analysts, like to have those types of resources on call from a police standpoint?
They definitely are, especially in larger communities, but the challenge you face is it doesn't actually reduce the service of the officer. The officer still has to be present. And so if you're getting a call for service, legally, we're required to provide an officer to do that assessment. And if they're getting petitioned to be in a service, the law enforcement officer has to be there, or if they have to be cleared before they can be, they have to be there. And so it's a joint issue instead of an instead of. And so I know we're really working closely. A couple of our officers are really passionate about these issues and are trying to figure out different partnerships and resources. They do a lot of follow-up with individuals because when you work in a place like Mason and law enforcement, this is not the last time you're going to see that individual.
Right.
You know, so it's about long-term problem solving. It's not about just clearing a call. And so they're very aware of, if we don't get them the right resources, I'm going to be going out there in another month. So let's figure out what the right resources are. They're just running into roadblocks about resources.
Are, I'm just so glad that we're discussing this and that this is part of the presentation.
Yeah, we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach this year so that
Oh,
we're really focused on what is the services we're providing that maybe you guys are not aware of, but a lot of our residents are asking for and seeking. And so we really try to focus the trend on that. Of course, we could put in the number of calls we're going, but I don't know that really tells you where you're seeing some changes. And this is what we were trying to demonstrate, is where we're seeing a change.
reserve, could a reserve officer be the officer that sits at the hospital? Okay, because even that needs to be a, okay.
Fire department. So the fire department, one of the changes that we see is that we've increased the minimum to $15 an hour for the paid on call. And you'll also see that the CIP carpet replacement for Station 1 is in the fire department's budget. So the trend that we're seeing in fire departments is very concerning in that we're seeing a lot of laws and regulations and policies being passed that really seem to target, in my opinion, paid on call departments. They, are looking for different training, qualifications, regular testing that really seems difficult to manage unless you're working full-time and have a full-time staff that can dedicate to those things. This is very concerning because if Mason were to become a full-time department, which you can see the trends in other communities of how they've transitioned to full-time department, it would likely drive a need to provide medical to justify the staff. And the budget would likely increase. We did some comparables from 600,000 to almost 2.5 million. From my perspective, we want to avoid that at all costs.
And there's no commensurate increase in
No.
revenue
There's no,
because you don't get paid for hardly any of those calls.
especially a municipal providing, whereas a private ambulance company can turn down certain calls, a municipality cannot. And so.
We can bill, but we can't, we won't get paid.
Right. And so you see this trend across the board when you see departments start to transition to even a few full-time, because then you get less part-time who want to be participating. And then you start to get not enough part-time, so you need all full-time. And then you transition into, well, I can't justify for full-time staff all the time, so let's do medical. And it's this, you see this transition from paid on call to full-time fire department medical, and it's almost the exact dollar amount. You're seeing it from about $500,000 to $2.5 to $3 million transition in cost. And so what concerns me is if regulations start to make it really challenging for us to operate. We're seeing almost the exact same trend in police departments for small communities. when you start looking at the regulations and the laws that are being passed regarding additional training for our officers, that might work in a large department where you can have people off at training constantly and have enough shifts to cover. We don't have enough employees to have someone off at training constantly. And so what it feels like is a targeted approach that small communities are no longer going to be able to meet the requirements. And we're really aware of that and trying to advocate as much as we can for there being a differentiation between departments while still ensuring safety and training. We really focus on training in both our fire and police department. But some of the criteria really seem to be driving communities to either regionalize because you can't keep up with the liability and training, or that you're going to have to shift to a much higher costing department. So since we have some firefighters here, would you agree that that's a trend you're seeing, or?
Yeah, it's been coming for me, ever since. In contrast, when I first started, it was a 66-hour requirement. Now it's a 240 plus. And then the ongoing training, which leaves us very little. And we train every 2 weeks, and we have very little wiggle room about our flexibility and what we want to do just because we have to do all the required stuff. So we don't get to practice the things that we really do when we're out on a call, as opposed to practicing or meeting training requirements for something that we may not. That's a fair.
Yeah, well, and even officer training is, it's several hundred hours to fulfill it, and they've added, now they're adding more requirements to that, and you don't, without, if you don't have a good fire academy, you don't have firefighters. If you don't have good, if you don't have officers at all, because they aren't qualified, then you don't have a fire department. Because someone's got to lead, and if there isn't someone leading, sooner or later, everybody just kind of goes away. And anybody who's lived around here for a while, you may or may not recall this, but at one time, Meridian Township was a volunteer fire department. Delhi Township was a volunteer fire department. I think DeWitt's even got some full-time guys now, I'm not sure, but the point is now Meridian is all full-time, Delhi is all full-time, and they did that in the transition. They came in, somebody said, well, let's just hire a few full-time firefighters, they'll just be on shift, and then the part-time people, the paid on call will come in and supplement them, but it just doesn't work, because eventually, first of all, the full-time people are always represented by a union. And so the union is always going to push to say, well, why are all these paid on call people doing the work that you could hire more union people to do? That's just a real pressure. NISA is going to go, I'm going to almost predict right now in a few years that NISA, which is Williamson Weberville, is going to be a full-time fire department. And because they've started on this path, and and it does not lead to better service, ever.
So the training's the same.
Training's the same, plus Delhi has to call us for help, Meridian has to call us for help. I mean, they have to call Dansville for help, I mean, because they don't have enough people. They couldn't afford to hire enough people for the big event.
What was Charlotte going on? What was that?
That was, when I went through my fire inspector class, one of the guys that I went through was a full-time Charlotte firefighter. And there's only like 6 full-time guys over there. And
That's the other one I was thinking, Charlotte's gonna be, all full-time. Well, they are now.
and what happened was they had a new city manager come in. Some new city council people that decided that they knew the firefighting business better than the firefighters, and started pulling duties from them that they had historically done and should be doing. Then they started dictating to them which trucks they should take to which calls and those kinds of things. And it just led to led to what it led to. The volunteers all quit. The fire chief quit because what was coming out of City Hall. And I think it's really all could have been avoided if they had just communicated and asked questions, and not presumed that they knew, after all the training that the firefighters and the chiefs and everybody has to go through, that you could get elected to city council and know the proper way to fight a fire.
Yeah.
I can tell you as a city manager, I know that city manager well, and I've heard it's been resolved. So they are in a positive, they have a new chief, and it's moving forward in a good way.
All paid on calls came back?
Yes,
Good.
yeah,
Um,
and I can't remember, was the mayor, or the city manager, one of the two at first said if they wanted to come back, they had to reply. Well, they got off of that.
I will say, when I came to Mason, coming from a community, my past experience with a full-time department.
Yeah.
A paid on-call department, no offense, for yours, is a challenging thing to manage when you are trying to figure out the differences between full-time employees and building really a culture where people want to show up and come, because the pay is not the reason they're coming. And so figuring out how to balance that in a way where everything as a city manager, you're thinking rules, requirements, regulations, how do they follow these processes? You have to kind of figure out where are the things that are most important to ensure that that culture continues. And so it's not an easy adjustment. I can see where city managers would make a mistake of trying to shift it because it's not very comfortable. But I can tell you when it works really well. And that's the focus that we have to have. And honestly, the culture we're trying to create for the fire department for people to show up is the same culture we want in City Hall for people to show up, and DPW for people to show up. We want people to show up because they want to do work. And so it's figuring that we have, I think, a really good thing going when we talk about the relationships with our townships and partnering with them, because it allows there to be enough fires for the volunteers to feel like they're valued and they're getting things done and they're getting enough training. And so, but it's a delicate balance, and I know a lot is owed to Carrie and the past chiefs for building that culture, because I can tell you there are a lot of communities that cannot get anybody to be on the paid on call departments.
Well, and some of them surrounding us.
Yes,
We picked up part of Eaton Rapids Township because when they get a call out there, they'd get one person show up. And they would call us for mutual aid, and they knew they were gonna get a good crew. And we get that, people, the regular citizens don't really realize what a value they have with the fire department, because if Meridian has any kind of a big structure or a big fire, they call Mason first, because they know they're gonna get good trained and they're gonna get a lot of people. And most everybody in the surrounding area does the same thing. A lot of smaller departments in the area have looked to Mason to basically set their departments up the same as us, so.
no, great. Okay, moving on to community development. So this area has a couple of our CIP projects. It includes the corridor, Cedar Street, PIP, and our ordinance updates. I also wanted to provide some trend information on code compliance. We tracked some data. She had to step out. Since 2020, we have been tracking where the role really shifted to solution versus an enforcement role. And we wanted to provide some case data to show you that. We had 313 cases in that time frame. Not one civil infraction ticket had been issued during that to deal with those. We had less than 10, I think there were 8 fines for building permit related activities. So a contractor was fined for starting work without a permit or something to that effect, and wasn't responsive to dealing with compliance. 40% of those cases were resolved within 10 days or less, and we currently have 28 that are open. And I wanted to give you an example of the kinds of different approach we're taking. So we received a complaint regarding tall grass. A particular property owner claimed it was a wildflower garden, but there were several species present that had noxious weeds and just had become overrun. So our staff, our code compliance officer, connected the owner with the Sycamore Garden Club, and they actually went out as a volunteer project to help them manage that area and get out the noxious weeds and actually allow the wildflower garden to thrive in that area. And this is not alone. We've done the same thing when we've had snow clearing issues or things like that. Done a really good job of matching them with volunteers. We're working with a community service group to actually team up to, if we have seniors or people with disabilities that can't shovel their walks, to have them come out and be assigned. They've also had some interest in volunteering to mow where needed, if someone is in need. And so we're trying to figure out solutions that fit more of the values of Mason instead of the tickets, and working towards how do we find solutions. A lot of the time, what they're finding is the complaints we receive, unfortunately, the residents don't even know that a neighbor has complained and they wish the neighbor would have just told them. But a lot of our community members are not comfortable with approaching their neighbors, so they're calling us to complain, and then our code enforcement officers going out. The reason I wanted to share this data is sometimes I hear things like, we're really enforcement focused on code, and our person just goes around and looks for issues. That's just not the reality of the actual enforcement that's happening. But I will say this is a major shift. We previously, I know, had multiple tickets issued on multiple things from our previous code compliance approach. And this is a shift. And so people may have views of our code compliance department from previous. And we want to start changing that messaging, that if the code compliance officer is out there, she's probably trying to figure out a solution to help you. And working with someone to help remove that. We've had volunteers remove large bulk items and other things. I look at the report every other week where they provide me an update of the status, and the majority of them are getting resolved by the individual themselves or by the support of another group in our community. And that's always our goal. Now, there's always going to be ones that are the challenging ones, but we're not finding we have to get to that civil infraction point at this stage. Any questions on that? Okay, when we get into the next grouping, there's no significant changes in civil defense, disaster account, Department of Public Works, engineering, street lighting. We do have the sidewalk program identified, the CIP under sidewalks. We do have a 3% increase in our contract in refuge. I will say that I'm nervous about when that contract is up. I don't know when it's up, but they keep telling us that they can't wait for it to be up. So I know that we've gotten a deal by having such a long contract with them and the locked in increases.
They wanted it.
They wanted it to provide the containers, but now they definitely, recycling and some other things have increased significantly for their costs, and they're not getting, I don't think they had any revenue related to recycling in our contract. It was, which by the way, we did have a question about yard waste, and we did get confirmation that they are taking personal containers. That was a message for all their other residents. It was not for ours. So they do not need to be indexed. They recommend them be indexed, but they can be in personal
So
containers.
if it's in a plastic trash can, they'll dump the trash can. Okay.
The challenge is because we have a long-standing contract with Granger, which is one of the things they reminded when we called, we would love to get that changed. So, because there are other jurisdictions that they serve, they do not allow that. So when they do their general message out and they say that, Mason residents see it and think it applies to us as well.
Have they started spring rubbish?
To start, I can never remember. Parks and ball diamonds,
Oh, I guess. Sorry.
we have 2 CIP projects there. We have the Riverwalk Trail and the Jefferson Trailhead. And just as a reminder, these were projects that were approved by Ingham County so that we will be providing the match, but Ingham County Grant is providing the rest. Now, when we bid those, they may come in more expensive and we'll have to evaluate what we can do, but Ingham County has also been open to us coming back for an increase if they do come in higher. So, yes, Jeremy.
Rainer Park Playground,
It's not in this area. It's in a different fund.
will it be this year?
We'll get to that fund when we get there.
I think that is a no.
It's not in the general fund. That's not where that's coming out of.
So we're not spending any money on ballparks, ball fields?
No, well, I mean, just regular maintenance, but no major capital investments at this time. That will be after we do the park plan, and then we prioritize what, because each park will get 200,000, and you guys will prioritize what is covered in that 200,000.
Today, as a matter of fact, I was contacted by a guy that has a traveling team, consists of guys from all over the state. So they were looking for a place to practice, and I told them about our fields, and they came here from the Detroit area, they came here from, yeah,
Hayes Park.
at Hayes Park, they came
At noon.
from Detroit, the Detroit area, Kalamazoo area, Muskegon, all over the state. And I met them over there because the fields haven't been dressed, so I took them a rake so they could at least rake. And I was almost embarrassed to have them come to my community and see that the fence was missing a pole, and it was falling down and just looked like crap. But
We have to make some capital investments. That's part of our challenge, for sure. When we get into senior citizens, there's no significant change. The library project is in here, which we talked about at the CIP meeting. Christmas decorations, planning commission, workers' comp, all are similar in line. Retiree benefits do have some escalated increases in there, but they're just the regular payments. And then on the surplus, you'll see that there's a transfer out, and that's for 50% of the Burn Street construction. When we talk about the library improvements, just as a reminder, I've added a couple things to the slide based on some additional conversation. So I know some of you may be interested in what are the next steps, since we did not have a bid. We are starting to reach out to some of the contractors. There's one that seems interested. And so we're going to be talking to them about whether we can get them on board as a direct negotiation. After that contract is when we can do final fundraising, when we know the full amount. And we're still hopeful that we will have construction in 2022. I know there was a question by Councilmember Schaefer about the space. So I did do a summary here. The library currently has about 4,500 square feet in space available at their current facility, with before the renovations, with 2,500 accessible. After the project, they'll have 5,500, including the garage conversion, and allowing them to be at 3,600 square feet accessible. The police department only has 1,500 square feet, and that would include the garage being converted in order to get that 1,500. All of that would be accessible, but it's significantly less than what they currently have.
Okay, thank you.
So the budget breakdown, if you look in your budget, this is one of those projects, which honestly, all of our capital projects, we're gonna have this challenge of crossing over funding years. So I have a breakdown here of what was in 21-22, 22-23, and 23-24. Those may shift depending on when work can be done, but it gives you an idea of how the project is spread out. So when we get to special revenue funds, this is the major and local street funds, and some of our new funds, as well as the building inspection fund. So major and local streets, you'll see here that we do not account for Walnut Court, but we have not accounted for it in year 2 or 3 because we only put in what was approved for the CIP. So when we amend the CIP, that will adjust some of the street work depending on the prioritization of Walnut Court. So what is in major and local streets is Barn Street, as well as Columbia Street Bridge connection. We are establishing a new fund called the Parks, Trailways, and Pathways Fund. This will be where we will track all the mill work, and that is estimated at about $245,000 each year. We are putting in the Rainer Park improvements in this fund to track, because we will be matching it with the mill allocation for that year, but we'll also be including in it the grant dollars from the DNR. So that's the revenue associated with that when you see that big uptick in 22-23. So we have not gotten a grant agreement yet from the state, and we cannot move forward until we get that. So we anticipate hopefully getting it in the next month or two.
Have we gotten the plan for it yet? The plan was supposed to be out this winter.
The master plan?
Yeah.
We're still working on that. We gave an update at the CIP that was gonna be closer to June or July. It's not gonna impact the playground, it's gonna be for the overall park.
Okay, but the question I still ask, is it gonna be done this year?
I have no idea, it's highly unlikely with the way that bidding is happening. We don't have a grant agreement, so we cannot bid the project. And all the work that we're bidding now is saying it's a 6 to 7 month lead time
And 40% more than. what
and
we
40% more than we anticipated.
But had we done it 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when it was budgeted at 200,000 and then 350,000, now 485,000. If we wait another year, it's probably gonna be 560,000. There comes a point where we just have to do it. We can't wait for the drain commission. We can't wait for a grant. We gotta do it. Either
No,
tear the
we
damn
don't-
thing down.
We
or-
don't have the money to do it without the grant, Jerry. We don't have the money to do it. We need the grant in order to facilitate the project. We didn't have the trail, we didn't have a park millage before this year. We didn't have the money to
Well, I
do it,
understand that, but
so we couldn't have done it before this year.
it's been 4 years. And nothing's been done to it. Not a darn thing.
That's actually not true. They've done quite a bit of
Oh, they
work.
put in a few
Fixing
boards
things
and they put some wood chips in.
Well, I guess I find it interesting, Jerry, you know, it's been 25 years and we haven't got a defined contribution retirement plan. It took 15 years to get a fire truck fund for investing. We've got softball fields that haven't been touched in 30 years. So I get it. This is your thing. This is your project. This is the thing you're passionate about. But all of us have things we're passionate about, but we all have to deal with the reality that money doesn't just grow on trees for us. And we have to set priorities, and the council as a body does that. And this, the one good thing this city has done for years, I just wish I could convince you of that.
You
is we've
can't.
been prudent in our planning. We've planned for things so that when we needed the money to do it, and we were strategic in setting ourselves up, we could actually afford it and do a good job, and then set ourselves up to do the next big thing. And that's what's been happening here.
But this big thing keeps sliding down, sliding down.
And now it's sliding down. I don't disagree with you. It's now sliding down, just like the wastewater treatment plant and the DPW project is sliding down because of COVID, because of conditions and situations outside the city's control, outside of Deb's control, outside of Mike's control, out of your control, my control. We can't, I mean, when you look at the fact that our road bids came in at 30% more than the engineer's estimate, that means they actually were more like 40 or 45% higher than what we expected them to be, because our engineer estimates are almost always high. That's a reality. We can't change that. There's nothing, and we didn't cause it. Yeah, we could have done it 6 to 8 years. We could have done it 10 years ago before Deb even got here. But we could have
We
done a
just
lot of
keep
things.
kicking the can down the road.
We're not though. That's what I
But you
guess I
are.
don't
We
understand.
are.
No, we're not. We have a plan, and as Deb said, we're
The
to the
plan
point of
was
the plan.
2 years ago.
No, the plan was to get a funding plan in place to do the right thing with this park, to do the right thing with this playground. And so we're doing all the right things. We're putting together a plan for the park. We've gone out and gotten grants so that we can pay more money than we would have been able to pay to put in a better playground.
But
And
they're
yeah,
not gonna raise the grant money next year. Grant money is grant money.
Jerry, I don't disagree, but I just take exception to you making all these comments constantly. This is being kicked down the road like it's being singled
Well, you
out in
can take
some
a
way.
second.
Like it's being
objection
singled
all
out in
you
some
want,
way.
Russ, but
We
it's
have
the
kicked
truth.
several things down the road, Jerry, not just this, because we don't have infinite resources. And I think it's time that everybody just accept that. And it's gonna get worse. For the next 4 or 5 years, it's gonna get substantially worse. We're gonna start kicking road projects down the line. We're gonna start not doing roads because we can't afford to do it, just like this year. We kicked a third of our, 20% of our road projects for this year kicked the can down the road, kick the road plan down the road, because we don't have the money. This is the closest project that we have that's actually going to get done. The library is the one I'm more worried about. This one, I think we'll actually have a chance to get it done, but until we get the grant agreement from the state. And then the last big thing, what's it gonna cost? I'm not even worried about the timing, because if you can lock in the price, they'll do the work. But this $400,000 project, you're right, it might end up being a $560,000 project or $600,000 project.
And that's okay.
No, it's not, but there's nothing we can do about it. I don't know why you keep acting like somebody in this room or this building is working against getting this done. That is absolutely not happening.
Doesn't the high school honor group society or group?
They did, that was
Go
turned
ahead
down.
and weatherproof the lacquer, whatever you call it, the playground every year?
We used to do that,
I
but
don't know if they have that or not.
that
Have
has
you
happened.
asked about that?
It has happened in the past, and I remember Deb
Yeah.
actually came back, I think it was Deb that explained to us that that just became very difficult to do because the school couldn't produce the people to do it. They had a period of time there where they did, but it just, it takes a lot of people to do that. I mean, there's
Can we ask?
all those little 1-by-1 boards, you
I was
got.
also told the liability. The city didn't want to pay the liability.
That's never been a statement I've made.
I
on
just,
liability.
I just remember we
People
couldn't
You
count
didn't
on,
tell me that.
we couldn't count on the people.
The people volunteering from the school?
No. That the city didn't want to pay the liability costs.
I
To
don't
have
know.
them, to
I don't
have
know.
students work on
We have
the,
students work on things all throughout the city, so I don't know what that would be referring to.
well, I didn't make it up.
Well, they all sign waivers, and so we always address city liability issues, and they all volunteer. We have groups volunteering all over the city from schools, and they sign the waivers. I want to make it clear that we are, if you can't tell from the path that we talked about, this is not where staff wants to be. I can tell you, I understand your frustration with Rainer Park, but I am way more frustrated about DPW. And I can tell you, when we had an in-service and I met with the DPW team separately, the amount of frustration by a staff who has been told that they were gonna have a building, probably 10 years ago, and they still don't have, they have one bathroom serving them that's not accessible, and they have ice in their break room. We're not happy with where we are. None of us are, but we have to figure out how to deal with the things that we have. And unfortunately, these have all teed up at the same time, at the worst time when it comes to financial, because everyone else is teed up at the same time. I can't tell you that our wish list on here is gonna get done this year. I can't tell you that, because I can tell you, I walked into the library bids convinced that we were gonna walk out with at least one. And to have bid it twice without any, we have no idea what we're gonna be facing. And we definitely didn't expect the street bid to be the way that it is. And we're hearing from communities all over that are getting no bids on street work. And so we're in a different time and we have to adapt, but we're committed to moving forward. But we have to move forward with what we're dealt with right now. One of the things that we have talked about is, do we adjust it? We were planning to do a community build, and is that even feasible? Because is that gonna take too long to coordinate and move forward? And are we gonna have a company that wants to bid on that if it's a community build? And so how do we streamline the process as much as possible? So moving on to the building inspection fund. So this is a fund that we set up just to deal and track with building inspection fees and costs. This is required for us to charge fees because we have to base it on actual cost to implement. So one of the trends that I wanted to identify that I alluded to earlier was that we saw a trend of contractors failing to close out permits for our residents. So this was causing issues when they would go to sell or when they were wanting to make another improvement. They had no idea that they had an open permit on their home. And so at the start of 2022, staff reported that we had 156 expired permits dating back all the way to 2019, just in that threshold. So in less than 3 months, our staff worked to close all but 17. So that was a combination effort and really working with homeowners, because as you can imagine, most of these homeowners, their contractors are long gone, and they just need to get final inspections, or they need to have an inspector come out and do a view of the work. And so since then, we've implemented an automated notification system. We're really trying to have customers understand that they should hold payment until the final inspection, and also giving them status updates and notifications at each stage so they know the status. This is one of those things that when we talk about words kind of changing the view, when we started talking about how we serve our neighbors, this was one of those things where I personally, and I know other people in City Hall, found out we had expired permits that never got final. We had no idea that the contractor hadn't filed them. And so really figuring out how do you help a resident through that who has no idea how to solve the problem, but just wants to get it resolved. And so that really took a lot of our staff time focusing on that, but from a perspective of how do we make this easier for the customer to get them closed out. So the next fund that's a new fund is the American Rescue Act Fund, which is where we're tracking the allocations that we're receiving. The final rule, if you remember, we've gone through quite a bit of a transition. We had the proposed rule, the legislation, and we really thought that there was going to be a lot of challenges with doing revenue loss recovery. But they have created a new standard allowance in the final rule that allows smaller communities, in particularly, to really use it as revenue loss recovery without a lot of tracking. So we always knew it was going to go in the water and sewer fund because it's really, we had a lot of revenue loss in that area, but we were concerned that if we targeted it toward revenue loss, would that trigger other requirements as far as waiving fees and things like that. They've eliminated all of that in the final rule, so we will be putting it towards the water and sewer fund for just the revenue recovery. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that impacted actual rates because we were able to get access to that funding.
Hey Deb.
Yeah.
Does the, this federal rule or gas fee require that this be its own fund, or is it just simply proactively doing for track?
It was not a requirement for its own fund, but the state and the auditors recommended it for tracking purposes.
And I guess I want to point out. That happens all the time. I can tell you in the fire service, that's all these rules Deb talked about, the vast majority of them are not actual rules. It's because somebody said, this is how you cover your ass. It literally is that. The kind of stuff that the finance department and the different department, I'm not even gonna talk about probably what Mike's gotta go through with DPW and water and sewer. I mean, I mean, people have to understand that a lot of times I can understand why Deb or Michelle or somebody has a hard time explaining to us why, because they don't even know. Because no one can answer them. No one can tell them why it's so important that this happened. Well, the auditor says we should do it. Well, tell them no. Well, then they put a comment on our audit. And then when we go to sell the bonds for the wastewater treatment plant, we don't get the best rate. So, I mean, there's a lot of that crap. Am I wrong?
No.
I mean, it's a lot of it. And I bet if you, and I know about it from my time on the fire department and as the training officer for the fire department, the things that, you know, we say, this is what the state says we have to do. And then what other people like Myrma or whoever says we should do. Are they a requirement? Not legally, but we end up having to do it anyway.
Well, and for us, I think, you know, whenever you're dealing with federal funds, even in the course of this last year, their rules have changed significantly. And kind of the guidance is separated from everything else so that you can really track it and you can demonstrate that this was used for this specific purpose and it wasn't intermingled with anything else. And so I think it's a best practice, but it's also, to your point, a little bit of covering our butts as things evolve and where are we really gonna be and what are the real requirements gonna be to close out these allocations. You gotta remember, we're a small receiver. You're dealing with people dealing with the same rules, like the county who got, I don't know, I think like 40 million or something like that. So I mean, we're not even in the same ballpark as some of the other jurisdictions receive that are following these things. So we appreciate that they have this carve out for smaller communities. That's really making it a little bit easier for us. Rainer Bond Fund. So these are the projects, CIP projects. We have Leyland Park, the completion of that, the plans, as well as the Riverwalk Trail evaluation repair. You saw this in the other fund, but this is where the revenue will come for the match and the transfer, and then the Jefferson Trailhead, this is where the match will come for that. So,
Just one question.
Yeah.
Do you have a total what we've spent on Leyland Park in the last 4 years?
we can get that for you.
If you would, thank you.
Rainer Bond Fund is the IVA bond,
Correct.
not Rainer and Bond Park,
Correct.
because that's where I want to go.
Yes. Tax increment financing funds. So we have the Downtown Development Authority and the Local Development Financing Authority. The Downtown Development Authority, not a lot of significant changes. They did have an increase, but it's geared towards funding some of the soft projects and some other things, but no capital projects this year. Local Development Financing Authority, I wanted to spend some time just emphasizing how important the LDFA is to us. They are funding entirely the wastewater treatment plant study, the design. And so we're talking about $1 million that we don't have to come out with from the water and sewer fund because they're funding that completely. And then they will be contributing a lump sum of approximately 2.8 million when we're ready to move forward with the project. And then ongoing about 600,000 each year. So without that revenue stream, that would all be things we'd have to come up with from the water and sewer fund through rates. And so the LDFA is really an essential part. They kind of are this mechanism over here that has some revenue, but it allows us not just to capture local taxes from the city, but from other jurisdictions, taxing jurisdictions, and put it towards this project.
And just to be clear, if we weren't using this money for the wastewater plant, we couldn't use it.
Right,
It's
this is the
only-
last project.
This is the last project, so that would be money that would just.
I should say this is the last large project. It does
Yes.
allow for some transportation, things like the sub-area plan and some things like that. But this is the last large project identified in the plan. We would be closing out that and we would not be getting the capture from those other jurisdictions.
Deb, I hate, can I go back and just ask you, can you generally describe what's in Leyland Park Phase 2? Because I thought I could look it up in the CIP, but I realized you don't have current year CIP stuff in here, so it's not.
Yeah, Leyland Park Phase 2 is the pavilion improvements. These were things that you guys had.
Bathroom
The back.
updates, right?
I think they're just minor updates to the bathroom. It's just opening up the pavilion, which you
Okay.
guys remember last summer
Yep,
you
yep.
talked about. And then I think it's repainting. And
Okay, you just
Yeah.
nailed the big cost, the pavilion. I couldn't remember.
well, and I know that we're reviewing bids right now for those improvements that are gonna be a challenge. So those numbers may not be where we land,
Yeah.
but that's what's remaining in that. Any other questions on the LDFA? Now we will go to water and sewer fund. So we are proposing, we might as well just say it right up
Bum,
front,
bum, bum.
a 12% rate increase. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that and why we're proposing that. First of all, if you look at the CIP projects, we have 3 projects that are coming out of the water and sewer fund. Well, number 9, the Headworks and Barn Street utilities. And so we are gonna talk about how we came up with this percentage increase, but I wanna just note that I know, you all know we started the utility rate study. Because of COVID, we paused it, and now that we are under design for the wastewater treatment plant, we wanna wait till we have those numbers before we move forward, because it's not gonna be very helpful without it. And we also, as we mentioned, put the federal funds for COVID in the water and sewer fund, which was a contribution of about 445 each year. Without that, we would be utilizing about 390,000 of our fund balance, even with the 12% increase, if that gives you an idea of where we are from a fund perspective. So I want to talk a little bit about our water rate trends. You can see the percentage increases over time. You can also see where we land compared to other communities. You know, we all talk. And so Michelle and I were just talking. I heard Portland's about to do a huge increase. They were in the range of 40%. You were just saying there was another one that was about to come out with an increase. Grand Haven's about to come out with another increase. So we know that there are going to be quite a few hitting. We know Williamston's coming out with a big one. So we're all in the same boat as far as trying to balance out the cost of what the water and sewer fund. But the interesting thing, and not a good way in Michelle's world, but an interesting thing is when you start to look at water usage. This is where we're running into some problems. So when you look at this chart, which Michelle's team did a great job of putting together, you look at 21, 22, we had our lowest usage in 5 years. So when you talk about low usage, the challenge with that is you guys doing rate increases based on usage, not ready to serve rate or anything like that. You're gonna see decrease in revenue attached to that. And so when we look at, if you do a 1% rate increase, it's approximately 30,000 in revenue is about averaging out what we get. And you look at where we landed with the actual revenues of last year, and instead of that 11% increase, it was actually about 2% that we actually got with revenue. And so we're just not getting the usage. And that's a challenge because the costs are still increasing. And so when you start looking at the accumulation, I was adding up just in these, if you looked at 2016 to 2021, you would accumulate to it being like almost a 27% increase, but it related to actual revenues increasing being less than 10, I think. And so we're just not, the usage is down, and we're trying to figure out if this is a long-term trend, but it's feeling like it. Because there's definitely more efficiencies. A lot of businesses have decided to come back with reduced hours, and they seem to be staying that way. So we're just not sure how that's gonna even out. That's why we're recommending the 12% increase, because at the end of the day, we have to get up to a certain revenue to cover these large capital expenses.
Well, I guess I think it's important to note that usage has been going down since, well, in your own chart, since 2016.
Yeah,
So this is gonna be the future, because the big push is efficiency and the environment and take care of this and that.
and
So
bottom line.
bottled water, and so everybody's going to be pushing that way. I think it just makes it that much more important that we do restructure our bill to work in the fixed costs.
Right.
So we can recover them, because the fact of the matter is it's this chart that you have here on the previous slide that shows us compared to other communities is probably the most dynamic chart in this entire presentation, because every year that's going to change, because everybody's going to be going through this, especially now with inflation at 7% or whatever it is.
And we started working on a new chart that breaks out the rates, ready to serve versus commodity rate. And it's pretty remarkable to see the ready to serve rate is like half for all these other communities at least.
Mhm.
So they're not as dependent on these fluctuations in usage.
All that does is support the businesses. That cuts their costs. It just passes the cost on to the average homeowner to support the businesses. Leslie right now averages $36 a month and ready to serve. And that's Leslie,
Where are we?
for $295.
Well, and I can tell you, they've talked to us and they're probably gonna be doing a 30 to 40% rate increase in Leslie. From what that is, I mean, they just can't cover their costs.
They don't have industry either.
I think you're right, Jerry. I think that's what we gotta look real carefully at when we do the rate study is balance, because I agree with you, that if it's, you know, that's the trade-off between just charge everybody a flat fee versus, you know, buy your use, and maybe there's a way to do that.
Well, could you do a ready to serve based on the meter
Yeah.
size?
Yes,
So, I mean, that would help at least. But I mean, I have just as many concerns about ready to serve. I know that it can negatively impact our seniors or our households but the reality of the system, this is the challenge I have, is the reality of the system is what we're running into is it doesn't matter what the usage is, we still have costs. And we have to figure out a way to, and it gets confusing when you talk to residents, because they're like, well, if usage is down, your cost should be down. And they don't understand that there is a standard amount of costs associated with just running the plants and the infrastructure. And that's why a lot of communities have shifted to ready to serve, because that you can explain that these are the fixed costs to run it no matter what the usage is. But it's not a perfect solution in any way. And I know I've gone back and forth, I know Michelle's gone back and forth, and her team has gone back and forth. There's definitely some on both sides very strongly of whether we should move to a ready to serve or not. But I can tell you 21, 22 is a concerning indicator. If this is the direction we're gonna go and we're gonna have some large infrastructure investments we're gonna be making, how do we support them if it's only on usage?
Well, and you'll see more and more of that, not only people on fixed incomes or what have you, that they see an increase in their bill and say, okay, well, how do I get my bill down? I use less water. So they cut their usage, and that pisses us off, so we raise the rate some more. It's, you know, it's,
It doesn't piss us off.
Are there certain months where their usage goes way down? Does it go way down in the winter? How much of that is because our citizens are going south and using water in Florida instead of here? I'm just asking the question. Is
So
that
what difference does it
possible?
make?
What?
What difference does it make? They're not paying any usage because they're not getting any water. They're
That's
just
what I'm
paying
saying.
the
Well, that's,
$2.95 a
well,
month.
but there's an advantage to ready to serve because you're still getting money out of them, even though they're not drawing any water.
Right.
When they go to Florida.
You're still having to manage the infrastructure.
That's what I'm saying.
And all those things.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's why
Yeah,
ready to serve makes
if
sense.
if they're snowbirds and go south and don't use any water, then we pay for, our rates go up for those of us that use it. Stay here.
But that's where ready to serve handles that, because they still have to pay through the winter when they go south.
Right. But I think what Jerry's point is that we just need to be careful and conscious of the fact that the big water user is not getting a windfall because all of
Sure,
a sudden we're
sure.
charging the modest water users
Sure.
this flat fee.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
I have, in my rentals in town, I have three of them, two to three of them, depending on the month, that are right around 4 units. So, and I pay all the water bills. So I know what this is and what this means. So, to me, I think it's gonna be, we just have to get the study, and I understand we can't do the study till we know what the wastewater plant's gonna cost.
How long is the study gonna take? I feel like we've been waiting for this. study.
We can't do it till we have the cost of the wastewater treatment plant, because that's the main driver of the
Yeah.
study.
And considering that we just heard from Delta that just bid out their wastewater treatment plant, that they're over 40% higher than what they expected. It's just challenging. So we wouldn't want to base it off of the feasibility that study that we did 2 years ago, those numbers. So that's why we're in the design stage right now.
I find it interesting that from 16 to 2021, the revenue, budgeted revenues, I'm assuming this is converted to actual revenues on the whole year, but I don't know, go up until 20 and 21. They actually go down. During that time, our units billed was all going down. I just find it interesting what happened in 2021, why suddenly that year did our revenue dramatically go, I shouldn't say dramatically, it
Well,
went
it's
down.
depending on the meter and the user, right? It's different. So
And the use, like, I don't know early on years how revenues were projected. There's not good notes in our area for that. So since I've taken over, I've been using averages. And so the trend's been going down with you, so that's why revenue went down based on how I projected it.
But it's just interesting that our biggest actual, well, it's not because we've been increasing rates, so that's why it's happening. Okay. Never mind. This is a good example of something, I know Jerry doesn't want to hear it, and I don't blame him, I really don't. But we can't do anything about this, right? I mean, we had the wastewater treatment plant built 3 years ago if it had been our choice. And this problem will be solved. We can't move certain aspects of this process along any faster than we are.
Well, Jerry talks about kicking the can down the road. You know as well as I do that
Well, this came
27
from 1998.
27 years ago, there were plans for a new wastewater treatment plant on the shelf. And when Wyeth went out of business in the nineties, they said, well, we don't have to hurry into building it now because our capacity's just increased because they're not using as much, so. It's been getting kicked down the road for about 30 years.
I just feel sad because even though the expected earlier last year, we talked about 8%. And we knew that would be hefty as is, and then, you know, we were hopeful for all the grants and everything and the extra funding, which is great. But then we let the Parks Millage go out to vote prematurely. You know, people voted for that assuming 8%, like this will, there is nothing we can do. This is gonna hurt.
I do want to put it in perspective, because Michelle and I talk a lot about this. She hates that we use percentages. Because when you look at the actual increase per unit, you're talking about $2. And yes, it is a percentage increase, and it seems 12% seems very high, but in context of where we are compared to others, that's the part that I wish we could articulate it a different way. Because percentage is not very reflective of what.
I guess when I like that we look at other communities, what they're doing, get a lot of trend data, but when it comes to this and to say, other, it just seems so dismissive sometimes. I know you don't mean it that way, but it's like,
No,
I don't really know
Yeah.
that,
what I'm trying to
people,
reflect is when you talk about.
elders living, paycheck or month by month is, they really don't care what's going on in a community.
No, and I didn't mean to say it that way. What I was trying to reflect was if you look at this chart. So if you look at the increase in cost, where we're shifting, it's a $62 bill versus a $70. I know it all matters.
It's not a $60 bill versus a $96 bill, which
Correct.
leads to that.
Yes,
It's not a 50% increase. It's not 12% on $4,000. It's 12% on $60, which is, I think, what you're getting.
yeah, and we're seeing, I'm sure, you're seeing similar cost increase just across the board in things you're buying. So it's not this amount, I don't.
Yeah, like eggs are up 50%, or,
Mhm.
everyone just can't even afford a gallon of milk, like.
But it's important to reflect it based on dollars, because I think that gives a better indication, because I know when I hear 20% increase, well, it matters where you're starting from. It does matter where you're starting from, because is that a couple dollars? Is that $20? What does that mean? And so I think we got to put it in context. We got to figure out a way to articulate, but it's hard because it depending on your meter and some other things, the percentage, but
Well, percentage is what you're doing. You're increasing the
Yes.
rate 12%. And then we need to conclude with that, what that means for an average user. It means 62.59 to 70.10. It's $8 or $7.50 change.
Well, if
Is this-
you go by that reason.
Is
then
this graphic
when we get the
8% though?
40% increase for the wastewater treatment plant, we'll go from where we are right now to number one.
I mean, is this,
I agree, Jerry. The only difference is, like I said, this is the most dynamic chart in this presentation, because by the time that happens, I guarantee you Williamston will be sitting at 96.60.
well, and all the ones that are Board of Water and Land, I don't know if you've been watching the news and the rulings that they've gotten, all these communities that are getting additional admin fee for contracting with Board of Water and Light now owe that all back to their residents. And so they're gonna be hurting because they have increases on top of having to pay back through their fees these costs. And so it's just gonna lead to more rate increases across the board. So even the Board of Water and Light communities are gonna be struggling to come up with the revenue they need to cover those costs. So, I mean, it is, we all put in infrastructure around the same time. It's all failing around the same time. All these plants have been pushed off for too long. Williamston's replacing theirs, Portland's replacing theirs. I mean, the laundry list is, we're all in the same boat. It's the reality of the regulations we're facing, because we don't have options. These are the, go ahead.
this graphic on is it 6259 at 8% or 70 is 8% or is that 12% proposed?
62 is what we are currently.
Yes,
The 12% increase is the 70.
is the 70?
And all the rates listed there are as of their last increase, so we don't have incorporated what Lanston's gonna be raising it, or Leslie, or anybody else.
Okay, I thought that was for 8% on that graphic, but that is 12.
Yes, this is the 12. That 8% was what you guys approved last year. I can see where that can be confusing because these are on the same page. Any other questions on this? This is gonna be one of the major decisions that you're gonna have. This budget is gonna feel a little bit different because we're gonna have the creation of funds. We're gonna have, I'm trying to think of a couple of other things, the pension, a combination of quite a few things that we're gonna be combining, but obviously setting rates is a big one. So we will be recommending in that approval of 12% or in that recommendation of 12%. Motor vehicle pool. So motor vehicle pool, you have seen all of the projects that are identified in that. We, I think, have over the last couple of years done a better job of adjusting equipment rental to really reflect the cost to fully fund the motor vehicle pool as it should be. And so there's nothing here that you didn't see in the CIP. I did want to just make a comment about the CIP. I anticipate probably by next month, we're gonna be providing you an update on the CIP of projects that staff is prioritizing that we think need to be done at the beginning of the fiscal year versus ones that can wait till a little bit later in the fiscal year. We want to make sure we're in line with your priorities as well. For example, some of them, the back order on some of the vehicles is so far that we need to order them fairly early in the year. There were a couple other things that were actual compliance issues. I know the in-car radios or in-car equipment, for example, for the police department, they will no longer be serviced shortly after the beginning of the fiscal year because that equipment is so out of date. So that's a more urgent one. And so we're going to be identifying those, and the ones that we can wait a little bit, we're going to wait because we know costs are going to be fluid right now. But we want to bring that forward to you. So we are prioritizing even within the fiscal year of projects. So now we're going into Economic Development Corporation. This fund is just, we're using the final parts of it, and then we'll determine whether we can completely get rid of that fund. The Cemetery Trust Fund, this is the fund that the income earned can be used to offset costs. Not very many changes in either of those. Capital Improvement Funds. Capital Improvement Fund, we haven't seen a lot of activity in this fund, but this is where the DPW construction will be used to fund out of that. And then the Capital Project Fund for Fire Equipment, you see that we have the regular contributions. We do have an expenditure, I think, coming up in 25-26, so that will be able to cover that large expenditure. So that fund is just a reminder is where we're trying to eliminate long-term debt so we can pay for things upfront.
Well, hopefully inflation slows down like that. That's the 806 replacement, right? It'd be 806.
Yeah. Won't cover
It will at least make it less.
Palatable. There's
Yes.
more palatable.
Our hope is just to eliminate being able to have to take out debt to purchase equipment. So if that's something that can offset such a large impact to the general fund, that's the goal.
Well, and another strategy is to put more in.
We need to constantly evaluate kind of the estimates, which we still, I think we're using old estimates in the CIP. Because if you remember, they had some estimates in there. Mason Building Authority, this is where we will be using to obtain the debt for the public works. So you see a lot of these funds where we're getting revenue and but we're shifting it immediately to another fund. That's what's happening here. Special assessments. That's just a continuation. Where we track those special assessments, especially the ones that they don't pay all of it. into the transition. We have presented the budget. So now is the time. We have a couple follow-up questions, and I'm interested in hearing if there's any more that we'll try to get to you by the next council meeting. And then we move forward with the public hearing, and council at that time, in your budget, make any amendments that you want to make to it. Any questions or additional information that you want to make sure? I know I wrote down that we want to get operational costs personnel costs for general fund and the water and sewer fund. We want Leyland Park, how much we spent over the last 5 years. Did you have any other ones, Michelle? Or were there ones that were missing?
For trends to add to the report, is it difficult to add how many new businesses, percent of new people moving here and buying homes? I'm kind of under the property tax area. Like, is there a way to see?
We have home sales. Are you looking for? I don't think we would have a good way of tracking whether they are new residents.
Yeah, okay. Just my thought was if we had kind of that percentage, that is a nice trend setter too. That kind of lets us know.
And that one track renters, which I think are a lot of ways that new residents come in initially before they,
Why,
yeah, they date first before they.
right?
What is contingencies in the general fund, Department 890? What is that covering?
That is our annual voluntary contributions for MERS and OPEB.
Like resident retainment, is there a way to track that? Not really.
No, I mean, but I do think I know one of the things that I hope maybe comes out of the master plan is we have an action item of that welcome wagon that was in the previous master plan. I don't want to lose that. I think that's something that's very nascent that if we could implement. And is there a way that when we do have a home sale, that we can incorporate even state council members meeting with that information and gathering that information? Are you from out of town? How do we get you engaged? Do those things?
Yeah.
Because it would be a good way to understand when you're talking about 100 houses a year, is that feasible for a group to break up? I don't know.
Well, it's, back to culture, right? Because if we're gonna need a 12% increase water rates and all these other things, and people, we already have high county taxes, offering something really lovely, cozy.
Building trust.
Yeah, it's
That they know someone to
more
talk to.
valuable
Yeah.
actually to spend that time.
Anything else that you wanted to make sure we got information
Yeah,
on?
at your house. We'll invite them.
But they can pull out because they can't afford the water. So.
You should keep the pool so that you don't have to shower. That's what I'm saying.
Hey.
I grew up with a pool. We never showered in the summer.
Rusty, have a target for a budget public hearing.
Looking at the first meeting in May, aren't you? Usually. Because we have the public hearing and then try to not, and then schedule the approval at a subsequent meeting.
I think from a tight perspective.
Say there,
we can't
May.
Do the next meeting. It has to be the first meeting in May.
And maybe
From a May perspective.
For the public hearing?
Public hearing we would send tomorrow or the first meeting in May.
Right. You couldn't do next
that May
week's meeting.
second,
No.
first meeting in May.
It has to be.
No later than May 16th.
I know, and you've kind of instituted this lately, been last several years, done the public hearing on one meeting and then approved on the next. So if there was time, if something came out of the public hearing, that's not to say that council couldn't approve it, that same thing. So it could be offered the first meeting in May and for approval, or we could defer it if there's a number of things. And quite frankly, I just do it that way, have a public hearing and approval. If there's a bunch of questions, just defer it. We've got the last meeting in May, or second meeting in May is our last chance to approve the budget and still meet our charter.
Well, and just as a reminder, which we, I think, faced during the first year of COVID, you can approve a budget and amend it
Yeah.
later too, if
Yeah.
there's those issues. That's the only requirement is for you to approve it, but then
We approve amended anytime.
yes, yes. So we'll present it at that meeting as an approval, but feel free to defer it if you need more time.
I want to thank you and staff. This was a really, it wasn't too surprising. It's like we kind of know the challenges and schedule delays. I really loved the new feature of staff time. Like that really helps.
Are you officially adjourned?
I think we are. I don't hear anybody have anything to say.
Thank you all for taking the time and for sticking with it for one night so that we didn't have to.